Oh, stumbling upon this hidden refuge is no accident. Perhaps the Emperor himself guided your steps here. Follow me, sit beside the fire, and take some rest. There's a long road ahead of you among the stars, so feel free to ease your mind and listen to my tales. Tonight, we drift far into the deep past, to a shadowed age long before the Empire, before Vader, before Sidious. 1,000 years of war between the Jedi and the Sith, kindled by one fallen master's pride. From the ashes of a broken order rose a darkness that nearly swallowed the galaxy whole. This is the tale of the new Sith Wars, so settle in and let the long war carry you gently toward sleep. Our story begins roughly 2,000 years before the rise of the Galactic Empire, in an age the historians would later call the waning years of the Old Republic's golden centuries. The Galactic Republic still stood as the great governing body of the known galaxy, a sprawling union of countless worlds bound together by trade routes, shared law, and the quiet guardianship of the Jedi Order. On the surface, the Republic appeared strong. Its Senate still convened, its credits still flowed along the ancient hyperlanes, and its citizens still looked to the Jedi as protectors of peace and justice. Yet beneath that calm surface, cracks had already begun to spread, thin and quiet, spreading slowly through the foundations of the Galactic Order. For centuries, the Republic had known relative peace. The great conflicts of the distant past had faded into memory, their horrors softened by the passing of generations. The wars against the ancient Sith Empire, the clashes that had once threatened to consume everything, all of these had ended long ago. The Sith, that ancient order of dark side warriors who had risen again and again to challenge the Jedi, were believed to be extinct. Their old empires had crumbled into dust. Their fortress worlds had gone silent. Their teachings survived only in locked vaults and forbidden holocrons, guarded deep within the archives of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. To most beings alive in this age, the Sith were a story from a darker time, a threat that belonged to the past. The Jedi Order of this era carried itself with the confidence of the victorious. They had won their long struggles, or so they believed, and they had settled into the comfortable role of peacekeepers and advisors. Jedi walked the halls of power, counseled senators and kings, and mediated disputes between distant worlds. They trained their younglings in the ancient ways, passed down the wisdom of countless generations, and kept watch over the delicate balance of the Force. Their numbers were great, their reputation secure, and their belief in their own triumph deep and unquestioned. The Jedi had grown certain that the dark side had been beaten back for good, sealed away where it could no longer threaten the galaxy they had sworn to protect. That certainty would prove to be their greatest weakness, for the Sith had never truly died. Scattered clans of dark side practitioners still clung to survival in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, hidden away on remote worlds far from the reach of the Jedi. These remnants nursed their grudges across the long centuries, keeping the old teachings alive in secret, waiting for the day when a leader might rise to unite them once more. They were divided, weakened, and scattered, so scattered that the Jedi had ceased to consider them a danger at all. Yet the embers of the dark side still glowed among them, needing only a spark to burst back into flame. Throughout the long history of the Jedi Order, there had been moments when the Order itself fractured from within. These were the great schisms, the times when Jedi turned against Jedi, when disagreements over the nature of the Force split the Order and drove some of its members down the path of darkness. 3 such schisms had already scarred the history of the Jedi. each one a wound that the Order had struggled to heal. The coming conflict would bring a fourth, and this one would prove more terrible than any that came before. This fourth great schism would kindle 1,000 years of fighting, ushering in the ascendance of a new Dark Lord and the return of the Sith, along with a plague that would provide the grim drumbeat for the long dark age of the Republic that followed. The war that was coming would not be a single battle, nor even a single campaign. It would stretch across 1,000 years, generation after generation of soldiers and Jedi and Sith rising and falling, fighting and dying across countless worlds. It would grind on so long that entire civilizations would be born and die within its span, so long that the galaxy itself would be reshaped by its passing. Empires would rise from the chaos, only to crumble again. The Republic would shrink and darken, its light dimming across the stars. And through it all, the Jedi and the Sith would remain locked in their ancient struggle, unable to finish what would become the longest war their galaxy had ever known. Yet every great war has a beginning, a single moment where the first stone falls and sets the avalanche in motion. This 1,000-year darkness had such a beginning, and it lay not with some ancient evil rising from a forgotten tomb, nor with an invading army sweeping in from beyond the galaxy's edge. It began, instead, with a single man, a man who wore the robes of a Jedi, who was trained in the light, and who was trusted by those around him. A brilliant and charismatic figure whose pride would grow to swallow him whole, and whose betrayal would ignite a fire that took 1,000 years to extinguish. To understand how the darkness came, we must first understand this man, and so our tale turns now to a distant, shadow-cloaked world, and the master who was born upon it. Heavy clouds perpetually blocked the sun over the planet Umbara, leaving the rocky surface cast in a dim, eternal twilight. Luminescent moss and glowing vines crept up the trunks of the native trees, casting pale blue and green shadows across the damp soil. Here, a boy named Fannius took his first steps on the damp earth. The Jedi Order eventually found him, lifting him from the shadowed surface of his homeworld and bringing him to the bright, polished corridors of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. Fannius wore the traditional woven tunics of an initiate and wielded a standard training lightsaber, mastering the physical forms of combat with swift, precise strikes. He advanced through the ranks of the Jedi Order, eventually claiming the title of Jedi Master. He stood tall among his peers, speaking with a smooth, even cadence that drew the eyes and ears of the younger knights. When he lectured in the great halls, crowds of Padawans gathered around him, watching his hands gesture and listening to his detailed breakdowns of complex force techniques. Inside the meditation chambers, the other Jedi sat with their heads bowed, breathing deeply to align themselves with the current of the Force. Fannius kept his head raised and his eyes open. He looked at his own palms, curling his fingers into tight fists. He instructed his students to project their own desires into the energy field, forcing the current to shape itself around the user. In the council spire, he stood before the elder masters, his boots planted firmly on the circular mosaic floor. The elders leaned forward in their seats, exchanging glances and murmuring as Fannius detailed his views. He declared that his own consciousness formed the absolute center of reality. He stated that his thoughts and his will carried more weight than the collective energy of the galaxy, reducing the rest of the living universe to mere extensions of his own mind. The elders stroked their chins and lowered their gazes, their faces tight and their voices sharp, as they instructed him to temper his pride and bow his head to the greater will of the galaxy. Fannius turned his back on their instructions. He abandoned the communal dining halls and the open training courtyards. He locked himself inside the deepest sections of the Jedi archives, scrolling through ancient data tapes while the blue light of the monitors reflected in his eyes. He demanded access to restricted vaults, snapping his fingers at the archive keepers and speaking in a harsh, elevated tone. The archive keepers withheld the keys, gripping them tightly against their robes. Fannius tightened his jaw, turned sharply on his heel, and let his heavy robes snap around his ankles as he marched away. He sought out forgotten planetary coordinates and long-buried star charts, tracing the routes to abandoned worlds with the tip of his finger. He isolated himself in his personal quarters, sealing the heavy blast doors and turning off the main glow baths. He sat in the center of the dark room, levitating heavy metallic spheres and crushing them into flat discs, purely to test the limits of his physical dominance over matter. The day came when Fannius entirely abandoned the archives. He folded his Jedi robes and left them neatly on his sleeping cot. He dressed in unmarked, dark-woven garments and hooked his lightsaber to a simple leather belt. He walked past the temple guards in total silence, stepping down the grand stone stairs and blending into the dense crowds of the Coruscant underlevels. He dropped his temple comlink into a street-side disposal chute and stepped onto a commercial transport ship bound for the Outer Rim. The transport engines flared, pushing the ship through the atmosphere and out into the vast, star-speckled vacuum of space. Fannius traveled to dusty, unmapped worlds, stepping onto cracked, arid landscapes and walking through the ruined stone archways of ancient temples. He dug through the dirt and debris of these ruins, unearthing stone tablets and triangular crystalline holocrons. He activated these ancient devices, bathing his face in their harsh crimson light. The holocrons projected the flickering, red holographic figures of long-dead warriors and scholars. Fannius listened to their rasping voices, memorizing their instructions and mimicking their physical gestures. He practiced pulling energy directly from the living creatures around him, watching the small animals of the forest wither and drop to the dirt as he absorbed their vitality. His skin grew paler, and his posture became rigid. He gripped his lightsaber hilt so tightly his knuckles turned white. He spent hours striking at the stone walls of the ruins, leaving glowing, molten scorch marks across the ancient carvings. Fannius gathered these forbidden artifacts and loaded them into the cargo hold of his ship. He plotted new coordinates into the navigation computer, targeting the specific sectors where the scattered, surviving clans of dark-side users hid. He stood at the viewport, watching the blue streaks of hyperspace rush past the reinforced glass. He prepared to present himself to these hidden clans, ready to strip away his old name and claim a new title that would demand their absolute obedience. Fannius piloted his transport into the constant dust storms of the Outer Rim, setting the landing gear down on the cracked basalt surface of an uncharted planet. He walked down the boarding ramp, his boots crunching against the loose volcanic glass. Deep within the subterranean volcanic tubes, he located the first of the surviving Sith clans. The men and women of these hidden enclaves huddled around small chemical fires, wearing mismatched durasteel plates over torn synth leather tunics. They clutched rusted vibro-axes and ancient, sputtering red lightsabers with cracked kyber crystals. Their fortresses consisted of collapsed cave networks and repurposed mining tunnels, situated far from the established hyperlanes. Fannius stepped into their dimly lit caverns, raising his hands and displaying the glowing red holocrons he had recovered. The clan warlords charged at him, swinging their heavy axes and thrusting their flickering blades. Fannius sidestepped their attacks, driving his heel into their kneecaps and using the force to slam their bodies into the jagged cavern walls. He stood over the gasping warlords, his boots pressed firmly against their throats, and demanded their absolute loyalty. He repeated this process across a dozen star systems, traveling to swamps, ice worlds, and acidic wastelands. He dragged the defeated clan leaders onto his ship and transported them to a central, ruined amphitheater on a forgotten world. Thousands of Sith acolytes, mercenaries, and dark side practitioners gathered in the stone arena, standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud. Fannius stood on the central dais, looking down at the massive crowd. He stripped away the dark, woven garments he had worn since leaving Coruscant. In their place, he strapped heavy plates of blackened durasteel to his chest, arms, and legs. He draped a thick, hooded cloak over his shoulders, casting his face in deep shadow. He ignited his lightsaber, the crimson blade humming loudly and casting a red glare across the faces of the assembled crowd. He raised the weapon high above his head and declared himself the supreme ruler of the gathered clans, taking the title of Dark Lord of the Sith and adopting the name Darth Ruin. Darth Ruin paced back and forth across the stone platform, projecting his voice across the amphitheater. He instructed the crowd in his doctrine, a philosophy of pure, malicious solipsism. He ordered 2 acolytes to step onto the dais and handed them crude metal blades. He commanded them to fight over a single ration pack, watching closely as they slashed at each other's arms and legs. When the victor stood bleeding over the defeated challenger, Ruin nodded, reinforcing his teaching that only the individual will mattered. He mandated that every follower must view the rest of the galaxy as raw material, existing solely to be consumed and discarded for personal gain. He carved the tenets of this new creed of ruin into a massive obsidian monolith at the center of the camp, using the tip of his lightsaber to melt the words directly into the black glass. The acolytes knelt in the mud before the monolith, tracing the still glowing letters with their fingertips and whispering the words of the creed. Through constant immersion in the dark side, Ruin's physical form underwent a severe alteration. The skin around his eyes and cheekbones paled, stretching tightly over his skull. The irises of his eyes shifted from their natural hue to a burning, sulphurous yellow. His posture became rigid and aggressive, his shoulders hunched forward like a predator preparing to strike. His vocal cords thickened, dropping his voice into a harsh, grating rasp that echoed loudly through the stone corridors of his newly established fortress. He moved, with sudden, violent jerks, replacing the smooth, measured strides he had utilized while walking the halls of the Jedi Temple. He required his followers to avert their eyes when he entered a room, punishing those who maintained eye contact with swift strikes from his armored gauntlets. Back on Coruscant, the Jedi Council gathered in the High Spire, reviewing holographic recordings retrieved from the Outer Rim. The blue projections showed a towering figure in spiked black armor, leading hordes of warriors through burning settlements. The council members watched the figure swing a crimson lightsaber, observing the brutal, sweeping strikes and the sheer physical power behind each blow. They zoomed in on the figure's face, studying the yellow eyes glaring from beneath the heavy cowl. They examined the scorch marks on the blast doors and the collapsed support pillars left in the wake of his attacks. The Jedi Masters categorized this new Dark Lord as a newly emerged threat originating from the unknown regions. They analyzed his combat forms, his armor plating, and his harsh, rasping voice, concluding he was a stranger from the deep fringes of space. They catalogued the physical evidence and prepared their defenses against Darth Ruin, leaving the vacant seat of their former peer empty, attributing his disappearance to a separate, isolated incident. Soon the teachings of this new Sith ruler would seep directly into the Jedi Temple, pulling the minds of the active knights toward the Outer Rim. Inside the dimly lit archives of the Coruscant Jedi Temple, young knights passed small, encrypted datapads back and forth across the reading tables. The screens glowed with a harsh red light, displaying the translated tenets of Darth Ruin. The knights read the lines, detailing the supremacy of individual will and the subjugation of the galaxy under a single master. Soon, 50 Jedi Knights stood up from their meditation mats in the central courtyards. They unclipped their temple communicators from their belts and placed the small metal cylinders on the stone benches. They walked to the docking bays in complete silence, adjusting their robes and keeping their eyes fixed straight ahead on the hangar doors. The knights boarded standard transport shuttles, powered up the sublight engines, and flew up through the dense atmospheric traffic of Coruscant, breaking orbit and jumping into hyperspace along the routes leading into the uncharted territories. Back in the temple, the physical absence of so many knights altered the daily routines. The training rings in the lower levels sat empty, and the practice sabers rested cold on the weapon racks. The elder Jedi Council members walked through the empty dormitories the following morning. They picked up the discarded communicators and looked at the neatly folded tunics left on the sleeping cots. The masters stood before the central tracking console in the security spire, gripping their wooden walking sticks and tightening their jaws. They watched 50 active locator beacons go dark across the holographic map of the galaxy. Dust settled on the empty meditation mats, and the grand dining halls operated with entire rows of tables, completely unoccupied. The archive keepers took out heavy stone slabs and metal chisels. They carved the date 2000 BBY deep into the rock. Below the date, they carved the names of the 50 departed knights, labeling the event as the Fourth Great Schism. The council ordered the temple guards to seal the archive vaults with heavy blast doors and stationed double watches outside the remaining initiate quarters. The 50 transport shuttles landed on the cracked basalt surface of the Outer Rim world, kicking up thick clouds of grey volcanic ash. The Jedi defectors walked down the metal ramps, their boots crunching on the loose glass and jagged rock. Darth Ruin stood on a high stone dais in the center of the camp, wearing his heavy, spiked durasteel armor. The 50 knights knelt in the mud at the base of the platform, bowing their heads and placing their hands flat against the wet earth. Ruin ignited his crimson lightsaber, casting a red glare across the faces of the kneeling warriors. He raised his harsh, grating voice and formally claimed the absolute mantle of the Dark Lord of the Sith. He gestured to the surrounding camps with his armored gauntlet, naming this combined force of former Jedi and savage dark side practitioners the new Sith Empire. The newly fallen Jedi mingled with the ragged warriors of the surviving Sith clans in the training pits. They exchanged their refined, perfectly balanced lightsaber techniques for brutal, heavy-handed strikes, using rusted vibro-axes and crude metal clubs. Ruin forced them to spar in the mud, watching closely as the former peacekeepers drove their boots into the chests of their new allies and swung their blades with lethal force, drawing real blood in the practice rings. The clang of clashing metal rang out continuously over the volcanic plains. Ruin walked through the camps, physically seizing the clan leaders by the shoulder plates and shoving them into line alongside the former Jedi. He forced them to share rations, sleep in the same barracks, and march in unison, beating anyone who stepped out of formation with the heavy hilt of his lightsaber. The disparate groups forged a unified chain of command through shared bruises and cracked ribs. The acolytes built massive weapon forges near the cave entrances, shoveling coal into the roaring furnaces and pouring molten slag into iron molds to cast heavy armor plates. They constructed sprawling military camps across the planet's surface, erecting sharp obsidian barricades around the perimeters and planting red banners bearing the insignia of the Sith in the center of the courtyards. The military camps swelled with thousands of hired mercenaries, heavily armored war droids, and fully trained dark side acolytes. The wooden weapon racks overflowed with freshly forged blades and high-capacity blaster rifles. Darth Ruin stood on the balcony of his newly built fortress, looking out over the vast legions of heavily armed soldiers marching in perfect synchronization across the plains. He pointed his armored gauntlet toward the established hyperlanes leading back to the core worlds, directing the massive army to board the waiting fleet of assault cruisers and launch a full-scale invasion against the Galactic Republic. Darth Ruin's assault cruisers dropped out of hyperspace above the heavily populated outer worlds of the Galactic Republic. The massive, wedge-shaped warships fired concentrated volleys of green turbolaser blasts directly into the planetary defense grids. Republic defense platforms shattered into clouds of glowing debris. Sith dropships deployed through the wreckage, landing heavily on the paved streets of capital cities. The metal ramps lowered, and armored Sith acolytes charged forward, swinging crimson lightsabers and firing heavy blaster rifles. Republic security forces raised their own weapons, returning fire from behind overturned hover transports and shattered plasteel barricades. Jedi Knights arrived on the battlefields, igniting their blue and green blades to deflect the incoming plasma bolts. The new Sith Wars commenced, flooding the hyperlanes with the smoke and scattered hulls of burning capital ships. The Sith commanders carved specific titles for this expanding conflict into their command consoles and war banners. They wrote the words, "The War of the Fittest," across the blast doors of captured Republic outposts. They stamped the betrayal onto the armor plates of defeated Jedi Knights. Sith archivists recorded the ongoing planetary sieges in their holocrons under the title The Curse of Caledon. Republic military strategists and Jedi generals labeled the sprawling sequence of invasions as the Jedi-Sith War. The conflict stretched across the galaxy, spanning the time from Ruin's defection in 2000 BBY down to 1000 BBY. Through all these centuries, soldiers handed their blaster rifles down to their children, and Sith warlords passed their heavily modified lightsabers to new apprentices. Republic military forces surrendered planetary sectors rapidly during the initial decades of the fighting. Sith dreadnoughts blockaded the major hyperspace trade routes, firing on civilian freighters transporting food and medical supplies. Cargo ships drifted dead in the vacuum of space, their hulls breached and their engines leaking blue plasma. On Coruscant, the polished metal surfaces of the Senate building tarnished. Dust gathered in the massive transit hubs as interplanetary travel ground to a halt. Republic citizens retreated into underground shelters, rationing compressed food blocks and filtering recycled water. Piles of rubble choked the thoroughfares of once pristine ecumenopolises. The glowing neon signs of the market districts flickered out, replaced entirely by the harsh white glare of military searchlights. The Jedi adapted their methods directly to the heavy combat conditions. They left their traditional woven tunics in their temple dormitories. They bolted heavy cortosis plates over their chests and shoulders. They strapped blast-dampening greaves to their legs and secured thick utility belts carrying thermal detonators and medical stim packs. Jedi Masters stepped out of the meditation chambers and walked into muddy trenches. They stood beside Republic infantrymen, pointing their lightsabers toward the advancing Sith lines and shouting tactical commands over the roar of artillery fire. They constructed heavy fortifications around their outer temples, mounting anti-aircraft cannons on the stone parapets and digging vast networks of bunkers beneath the courtyards. The Jedi served as frontline generals, their faces smeared with dirt and their kyber crystals humming continuously on the battlefields. The battlefronts expanded into the dense jungles of the Mid-Rim and the frozen tundras of the expansion region. Sith war droids marched through the heavy undergrowth, using flamethrowers to incinerate the massive trees and clear landing zones for their troop transports. Republic walkers returned fire, launching heavy proton torpedoes that carved deep craters into the muddy soil. On the ice worlds, the heat of continuous laser fire melted the glaciers, transforming the battlefields into freezing, knee-deep swamps. The Sith acolytes waded through the icy water, deflecting blaster bolts and cutting down the Republic defenders. The sheer scale of the fighting required the continuous extraction of raw materials. Strip miners tore deep trenches into the crusts of uninhabited planets, pulling iron and dunium from the bedrock to forge new weapons and construct additional warships. Factory worlds operated endlessly, pumping thick black smog into the atmosphere and blocking out the sunlight. High above these burning worlds, Darth Ruin commanded the ongoing slaughter from the armored observation decks of his flagship. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring through the reinforced transparasteel viewports at the orbital bombardments. He issued rapid, direct orders to his fleet admirals, dictating fleet maneuvers and planetary strikes. He demanded total submission from his forces, entirely ignoring the physical injuries and casualties sustained by his own soldiers. He observed Sith landing craft exploding under Republic anti-aircraft fire, watching the metal fragments rain down onto the planetary surface. He immediately ordered the next wave of transports to launch into the exact same flak-filled airspace. He required continuous, aggressive advancement, forcing his commanders to march their own legions into lethal choke points simply to satisfy his singular vision of absolute dominance. Darth Ruin sat upon an elevated throne of polished obsidian, looking down at the ranks of his Sith followers assembled in the main hall of his fortress. He tapped his armored fingers against the stone armrest, issuing commands that sent entire battalions directly into heavily fortified Republic artillery zones. He watched the tactical holotable as the blue markers representing his own troops vanished, blinking out by the thousands under heavy bombardment. He simply pointed his finger at another sector of the map, ordering the reserve infantry to march over the crushed armor and broken bodies of the first wave. He demanded constant forward momentum, striking down any commander who slowed their pace. When an underling returned with reports of depleted rations or emptied medical crates, Ruin ignited his lightsaber and severed the commander's limbs, letting the body collapse onto the metal floor as a direct warning to the others. He required his forces to scavenge gear from the dead, enforcing a strict doctrine where only the physically dominant earned the right to consume the spoils of the battlefield. Lord Eradicus stood constantly at Ruin's right side, serving as his chief squire and enforcer. Eradicus wore a specialized suit of heavy dark armor, forged from thick durasteel plates and deeply infused with dark side energy. The metal plates of the armor radiated a faint crimson heat, absorbing the kinetic impact of blaster bolts and deflecting the physical strikes of vibroblades. Eradicus carried a massive double-bladed battle axe, the heavy iron head etched with Sith runes that glowed under the dim lights of the command center. He executed Ruin's orders with absolute precision, marching into the lower barracks and dragging acolytes who dropped their weapons out by their tunics. Eradicus swung his heavy axe, executing the exhausted soldiers in front of their peers, leaving the severed heads on metal pikes along the perimeter of the training grounds. Together, Ruin and Eradicus purged the ranks of anyone displaying physical fatigue or a slowed pace, enforcing a strict hierarchy based entirely on raw physical strength and immediate compliance. Ruin utilized his followers simply as biological shields and battering rams against the Republic lines. He ordered fully loaded troop transports to crash directly into planetary shields, using the exploding starships to create temporary openings for his heavy assault cruisers. He marched infantry battalions through dense minefields, letting the detonations clear a safe path for his own personal command walker. He stood on the viewing deck of his transport, watching the shockwaves rip through the ranks of his own acolytes, observing the blood and dirt rain down on the cracked earth. He instructed the medical droids to dismantle the critically injured soldiers, harvesting their cybernetic implants and intact organs to repair the high-ranking officers. He stockpiled stolen wealth, hoarding crates of raw coaxium, rare kyber crystals, and stolen Republic credits inside his private vaults. He sealed the thick blast doors and kept the resources strictly for his own personal use, while his frontline soldiers wore cracked armor and fired depleted blaster rifles on the battlefields. The surviving acolytes huddled in the freezing, damp lower levels of the Sith fortresses. They stitched their own wounds with crude medical wire and wiped the mud from their cracked visors. They looked at the vacant sleeping cots of the soldiers who had been sent charging into heavy artillery fire. They watched the heavy blast doors of Ruin's private chambers, listening to the hum of the power generators keeping his quarters heated and illuminated while the lower decks froze. They gathered in the dark corners of the armories, speaking in low, guttural whispers. They tightened their grips on the hilts of their lightsabers, their knuckles turning white against the cold metal. They counted the guard rotations around the central spire and memorized the security codes to the upper levels. The clan leaders and the former Jedi Knights stood together in the shadows of the training pits, their yellow eyes fixed on the towering silhouette of Lord Eradicus and the high throne of Darth Ruin. They traced the scorch marks on their own armor, running their thumbs over the deep grooves left by Ruin's brutal punishments. They slowly pooled their stolen rations and shared the power cells of their weapons, forging a secret alliance hidden from the surveillance cameras. They sharpened their blades and calibrated their thermal detonators under the cover of the constant artillery fire outside the fortress walls. The disciples positioned themselves at the key intersections of the command spire, checking the chronometers on their wrists and waiting for the rotation of the inner guard. Deep beneath the main command spire, the surviving Sith disciples assembled in the damp ammunition bunkers. They stepped over the cracked durasteel crates and stood beneath the flickering, failing glow lamps. They unclasped their heavily dented armor plates, exposing deep blaster burns, jagged shrapnel wounds, and severe thermal scarring across their chests and arms. They looked at the barren ration bins and the completely drained medical canisters. They held up their primary weapons, displaying the cracked kyber crystals and the exhausted power cells. They turned their yellow eyes toward the ceiling, listening to the heavy footsteps of Darth Ruin pacing across the metal floorboards of his private chambers above them. The acolytes gripped the hilts of their vibro-daggers and nodded to one another. They handed freshly charged plasma cartridges back and forth, sliding the heavy metal cylinders into their blaster rifles and locking the firing mechanisms into place with sharp, metallic clicks. They tightened the leather straps on their gauntlets and wiped the grime from their foreheads, recognizing the barren armories as their sole physical reward for their continuous battlefield victories. They turned their weapons away from the Republic forces and aimed them directly toward the high throne of their own master. High above the bunkers, Darth Ruin stood at the center of his personal war room. He leaned over a massive circular holotable, bathing his pale face and sulphurous yellow eyes in the harsh blue light of the projected galaxy map. He moved his armored gauntlets through the holographic star systems, sweeping entire fleets of markers toward the heavily defended core worlds. He raised his rasping voice, barking rapid commands at the servitor droids and mandating complete planetary bombardments. He required the extraction of raw materials from the newly conquered colonies, demanding the shipment of coaxium and kyber directly into his private vaults. He kept his back turned to the heavy blast doors, staring exclusively at the glowing blue spheres representing his targeted conquests. He focused his hearing entirely on the hum of the holoprojector, missing the heavy metallic thuds of the outer guard detail collapsing against the corridor walls directly outside his chambers. He simply pointed his finger at another hyperspace lane and demanded the immediate deployment of 3 more infantry battalions. The heavy blast doors slid open with a loud hiss of venting pneumatics. 20 heavily armed Sith disciples stepped onto the polished obsidian floor of the command center. They raised their weapons, surrounding the circular holotable and closing the perimeter around their master. Darth Ruin finally looked up from the blue projections, turning his head and glaring at the encroaching acolytes. He opened his mouth to issue a harsh reprimand, raising his hand toward his lightsaber hilt to exact his standard brutal punishment. The disciples lunged forward simultaneously, driving their boots against the floorboards to close the distance. 5 crimson lightsaber blades pierced the thick durasteel plating of Ruin's chest and back. Sparks showered onto the holotable as the superheated kyber energy melted through the internal life support systems of his armor. Ruin gasped, his yellow eyes widening as the breath left his lungs. He dropped to his knees, his heavy armored knee pads cracking the obsidian floor tiles. The disciples pulled their blades free, letting the Dark Lord's body collapse face down onto the metal grating. The acolytes stood over the smoking remains of Darth Ruin, lowering their weapons and staring at the severed pieces of his spiked armor. The leader of the strike team bent down, reaching his gauntlet toward the fallen master's lightsaber. Before his fingers could grasp the metal hilt, the disciple standing directly to his right swung a heavy vibro-axe, severing the leader's arm at the shoulder. The remaining 18 acolytes instantly raised their weapons against one another, igniting their blades and filling the command center with the chaotic hum of clashing red lightsabers. They drove their boots into each other's knees and thrust their weapons into their former allies' backs. Blood pooled over the blue light of the holomap as the disciples fought to claim the vacant throne. This physical sequence of assassination and usurpation replicated itself across every Sith camp, trench, and war cruiser. Apprentices poisoned the ration supplies of their masters, and squires drove vibro daggers into the necks of their commanding officers during the nightly watches. The unified Sith military structure shattered into hundreds of isolated, warring camps. The warlords hoisted their own distinct banners over their stolen fortresses, cementing 1,000 years of continuous internal slaughter as the surviving warriors marched out to seize individual control over the fragmented empire. Without Darth Ruin to dictate the rigid military structure, the command chain of the new Sith Empire collapsed immediately. The warlords and former Jedi Knights gathered in the ruins of the central fortress, standing over the shattered holotable and arguing loudly. They pointed their blasters at each other, refusing to acknowledge any single individual as the new Dark Lord. The strongest acolytes gathered their own personal loyalists, breaking away from the main camps and seizing individual star destroyers. These splinter factions flew their hijacked cruisers back out into the galaxy, establishing localized territories and fortifying remote planetary bases. The centralized Sith army fractured into dozens of competing fiefdoms, scattering the dark side practitioners across the Outer Rim and the unknown regions. These self-proclaimed Sith kings focused their immediate attention entirely on each other. They launched boarding actions against rival Sith dreadnoughts, cutting through the metal airlocks and fighting brutal close-quarters battles in the narrow corridors. Sith assassins infiltrated the encampments of competing warlords, dropping toxic compounds into the water filtration systems and leaving the bloated bodies of the victims in the central courtyards. The warlords diverted their resources away from the Republic front lines, utilizing their raw materials to forge heavy blast doors and automated defense turrets for their own strongholds. The constant infighting depleted their fuel reserves and drained their weapon batteries. The Sith Kings required continuous recruitment simply to replace the forces lost to their own internal squabbles, pulling mercenaries and pirates into their fractured ranks. Despite the complete fragmentation of the Sith command structure, the Galactic Republic continued to lose ground. The sheer number of active Sith factions overwhelmed the Republic's defensive capabilities. Republic admirals stared at their tactical monitors, watching hundreds of small, aggressive Sith armadas striking multiple planetary systems simultaneously. The Republic military stretched its forces thin across the hyperspace lanes, attempting to garrison every major trade hub and civilian population center. The decentralized nature of the Sith attacks made it impossible for the Republic to target a single command center or execute a decisive counteroffensive. The Republic cruisers constantly responded to distress signals, arriving in orbit only to find the planetary shields already shattered and the cities burning. The Republic slowly bled out, losing individual star systems one by one to the relentless, disorganized aggression of the warring Sith factions. The Jedi Knights fought continuously against the scattered Sith warlords. They engaged the dark side practitioners in dense urban environments and ruined industrial sectors, exchanging lightsaber strikes in the narrow alleys and across the elevated walkways. The Jedi established fortified outposts on the contested planets, rotating exhausted knights back to Coruscant and deploying fresh Padawans directly to the front lines. The constant combat forced the Jedi to refine their martial techniques, prioritizing swift, lethal strikes over defensive posturing. The knights carried heavy blaster pistols alongside their lightsabers, firing directly into the advancing ranks of Sith mercenaries. The ongoing conflict forced the Jedi to operate primarily as military commanders, entirely abandoning their traditional roles as peacekeepers and mediators. The Jedi Council issued continuous deployment orders, tracking the growing number of casualties and etching the names of the fallen knights into the stone walls of the temple archives. Decades turned into centuries as the fragmented Sith fiefdoms ground the Republic down. The Sith warlords conquered the Sictis sector, bombarding the planetary defenses and executing the local governors in the public squares. They captured the Mizra system, driving the Republic forces out of the major cities and converting the heavy industrial factories into Sith weapon forges. The constant territorial expansion provided the Sith Kings with massive stockpiles of raw materials and conscripted labor. They utilized these resources to construct new fleets of war cruisers, reinforcing their individual armadas and preparing for deeper incursions into the core worlds. The fractured state of the Sith Empire prevented them from executing a unified invasion, but the localized victories continuously weakened the overall structural integrity of the Galactic Republic. The Sith warlords eventually realized the limitations of their decentralized tactics. The strongest commanders recognized the necessity of a unified command structure to finally crush the Republic. The leaders of the most prominent factions began to eliminate their weaker rivals, consolidating their territories and absorbing the defeated forces into their own ranks. The warlords utilized brute physical force and targeted assassinations to establish dominance, slowly forging a new hierarchy from the ashes of the fractured empire. The scattered fiefdoms gradually merged into larger, more organized military coalitions. The surviving Sith kings gathered their massive fleets, preparing to launch a coordinated assault against the remaining Republic strongholds, setting the stage for the rise of the next dominant Dark Lord. The surviving warlords stood over their shattered holotables, pointing their vibro-axes at one another, until heavy footsteps echoed through the ruined halls. A massive figure, clad in thick, overlapping plates of dark cortosis armor, walked through the center of the command centers. He stood a full head taller than the largest Sith captains, carrying a heavy lightsaber with a uniquely elongated hilt. He drove his armored boots into the chests of the warring chieftains, knocking them flat against the metal floor grates. He pointed his crimson blade at their throats, demanding their immediate physical submission. He took the title of the Dark Lord of the Sith, adopting the moniker of the Dark Underlord. He consolidated the fractured fiefdoms by physically disarming any commander who hesitated, melting their weapons into liquid slag with his own lightsaber and forcing the remaining soldiers to fall into strict formation behind his heavy boots. The Dark Underlord walked through the mud-soaked training camps, selecting the largest and most physically aggressive combatants from the gathered legions. He stripped them of their mismatched armor plates and dragged them to the weapon forges. The labor droids poured molten iron and cortosis alloy into heavy molds, forging thick, uniform suits of jet-black armor. The selected warriors strapped these black plates over their chests, arms, and shins. They draped heavy dark cloaks over their shoulders and ignited matching crimson lightsabers. The Dark Underlord positioned these chosen enforcers directly behind his throne, granting them the title of the Black Knights. They stood perfectly still, their gloved hands resting on their weapon hilts, ready to enforce his orders by swiftly decapitating anyone who broke rank or spoke out of turn. The newly unified armada directed their navigation computers toward the distant coordinates of Malrev 4. The dark side practitioners brought their heavy assault cruisers down through the thick, swirling gray clouds of the planet. They landed their ships on vast plains of cracked rock and dense, thorny underbrush. The Black Knights commanded legions of conscripted laborers to carve deep foundations into the stone crust, using heavy plasma cutters and diamond-tipped drills. The workers stacked massive blocks of obsidian and iron, constructing a sprawling, jagged temple that pierced the low-hanging cloud cover. Heavy rain beat against the stone walls continuously, creating deep rivers of mud around the perimeter. Large iron braziers burned in the courtyards, filling the damp air with the thick smell of wood smoke and burning oil. The Dark Underlord sat inside the highest chamber of this central spire, looking through the narrow viewports at the glowing red exhausts of his war cruisers, lifting off from the landing pads. The Black Knights launched their cruisers toward the Zona Miki hyperspace route in the Outer Rim territories. Republic space stations hung in the vacuum of space, rotating slowly above gas giants and asteroid belts. The Sith dreadnoughts dropped out of hyperspace directly beside these stations, firing heavy grappling cables that pierced the outer hulls. The thick metal cords retracted, pulling the massive Sith warships flush against the station airlocks. The Black Knights ignited their lightsabers, cutting circular holes directly through the reinforced durasteel doors. They kicked the glowing metal inward and stepped into the station corridors. They fired heavy blaster rifles into the Republic security details, leaving black scorch marks across the white hallway walls and filling the corridors with grey smoke. They dragged crates of starship fuel, medical supplies, and raw ore onto their own ships. The Sith warriors planted thermal detonators along the primary power cores of the stations, launching their cruisers back into hyperspace just as the massive explosions ripped the orbital platforms into drifting fields of twisted metal and sparking wires. The automated distress signals from the burning stations flashed across the monitors inside the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. The blue holographic projections displayed the exact coordinates of the Zona Miki attacks, mapping the trail of destruction directly back to the dark planet of Malrev 4. A Jedi Master named Murtagh stood before the tactical displays, leaning heavily on the edge of the metal console. He watched the casualty reports scroll rapidly down the glass screens. He turned his eyes away from the other Jedi Masters in the room, reaching out to trace the hyperspace route leading to the outer rim with his fingertip. He unclipped a heavy leather pouch of Republic credits from his utility belt and placed it firmly on the table. He picked up a metal stylus and began drawing lines across the glowing map, plotting out a precise sequence of diversions to draw the Black Knights out of their fortress and leave the Dark Underlord completely exposed. Jedi Master Murtagh stood inside the dimly lit cargo bay of a neutral space station. He pushed a heavy leather pouch of Republic credits across the metal table. A group of Mandalorian mercenaries stood on the opposite side, wearing dented Beskar armor plates painted in faded greens and dull reds. The lead mercenary pulled open the leather strings of the pouch, running his thick, gloved fingers through the solid metal coins. He nodded his helmeted head, transferring the credits into his utility belt. Murtagh laid out a physical map of the Malrev 4 fortress on the table, pointing his finger directly at the primary anti-aircraft batteries and the main gate. He instructed the Mandalorians to fly their gunships directly at the main entrance and unload their heavy ordnance. The mercenaries checked the power cells of their heavy blaster rifles and locked their jetpack harnesses into place. They marched down the docking tube and boarded their assault ships, priming the sublight engines and jumping to hyperspace. The Mandalorian gunships reverted from hyperspace directly above the thick, grey atmosphere of Malrev 4. They dove through the cloud cover, firing barrage after barrage of proton torpedoes at the outer obsidian walls of the Sith temple. Explosions shattered the iron barricades, throwing massive chunks of stone and metal into the muddy courtyards. The Black Knights rushed out of the lower barracks, igniting their red lightsabers and shouting commands over the roar of the blaster fire. The lead Sith commander, a towering warrior wearing spiked shoulder plates, directed all available anti-aircraft cannons to target the descending gunships. The Sith acolytes ran toward the main gate, firing high-capacity plasma rifles into the sky and leaving their posts at the rear infiltration tunnels entirely vacant. The Mandalorians activated their jetpacks, dropping from the open bays of their ships and landing heavily in the mud. They fired wrist-mounted flamethrowers into the charging Sith ranks, setting the dark cloaks on fire and creating a massive wall of flames and thick smoke at the front of the fortress. While the Black Knights focused their entire arsenal on the Mandalorian mercenaries, Master Murtagh landed a small, grey stealth skiff in the dense, thorny underbrush behind the temple. He cut his way through the thick vines with his green lightsaber, stepping silently toward a narrow drainage grate in the rear stone wall. He sliced through the iron bars and pulled himself into the lower levels of the central spire. He walked up the spiraling stone staircases, moving past the vacant guard posts and the blank security terminals. The heavy thud of the artillery strikes masked the sound of his boots hitting the stone steps. He reached the highest chamber, pressing his hand against the control panel of the heavy blast doors. The pneumatic seals hissed, and the thick metal doors slid apart. The Dark Underlord stood at the center of the room, looking out the narrow viewports at the burning courtyards below. He turned his heavy, cortosis-plated body toward the doorway, detaching the elongated hilt of his lightsaber from his belt. Murtagh raised his own weapon, the green blade casting a bright light across the dark stone walls. The Dark Underlord lunged forward, swinging his crimson blade in a wide, heavy arc. Murtagh blocked the strike, the impact sending a shower of sparks across the floor grates. The two warriors exchanged rapid, heavy blows, cutting deep gouges into the iron braziers and shattering the thick glass of the viewports. The Dark Underlord relied on his massive physical size, driving his armored boots into the floor and pushing his full weight against Murtagh's blade. Murtagh deflected the attacks, stepping quickly to the side and redirecting the Sith Lord's momentum. He spun around the massive figure and drove his green lightsaber directly through the gap in the Dark Underlord's backplating. The superheated plasma pierced the thick armor and severed the Dark Underlord's spine. The massive Sith Lord dropped his weapon, the crimson blade powering down as the metal hilt hit the floor. He collapsed onto the cold stone, his heavy black armor clattering loudly against the tiles. Murtagh stood over the fallen warlord, retracting his own green blade and listening to the continuous explosions raging outside. He looked down through the shattered viewport at the massive army of Black Knights fighting the Mandalorians. The Sith warriors saw the top chamber go dark and looked up at the broken glass of their master's throne room. They simply tightened their grips on their blood-stained vibro-axes and turned their visors back to the battlefield, gripping their weapons tightly and preparing to march their galactic crusades forward under new leadership. Master Murtagh walked away from the shattered viewports, leaving the smoking remains of the Dark Lord on the floor grates. The surviving Black Knights stepped over the cracked stone tiles of the high chamber. They lifted the heavy cortosis armor plates of the Dark Underlord, hoisting the massive pieces of metal onto their shoulders. They carried the scorched black armor down the spiral staircases and bolted the plates onto the tallest commander among them. The new leader ignited his red lightsaber, holding the crimson blade high to illuminate the dark stone walls. He pointed the metal hilt toward the waiting assault cruisers on the landing pads. The Sith acolytes boarded the dreadnoughts, ignited the sublight engines, and jumped back into the hyperspace lanes, pushing their military campaign forward with immediate and unbroken momentum. The Sith dreadnoughts dropped out of hyperspace above the agricultural and industrial worlds of the Mid-Rim. The Black Knights marched their legions through dense crop fields and sprawling manufacturing districts, crushing the vegetation and plasteel walkways beneath their iron treads. They aimed their heavy blaster rifles at the local governors, taking direct control of the planetary grain silos and fuel refineries. They loaded the raw harvest and the refined coaxium into their cargo haulers, fueling their expanding armada. They built new fortresses over the smoldering ruins of Republic outposts, using the crushed durasteel barricades as raw material for their own spiked walls and heavy gates. They measured their progress entirely by the physical accumulation of captured hyperlane beacons, seized armories, and enslaved populations. Inside the Republic command centers on Coruscant, the circular tactical holomaps glowed with a continuously shrinking perimeter of blue light. The Jedi generals stood around the projection tables, watching the red markers consume the outer edges of the galaxy map. They tallied the physical inventory of their remaining forces on their data pads. The Republic infantrymen wore cracked chest plates and fired blaster rifles with nearly drained power cells. The central supply lines collapsed under the constant Sith blockades. Republic medical frigates drifted in orbit, their cargo bays stripped bare of Bacta patches, sterilization fluid, and synth flesh dispensers. The Jedi Knights wrapped their lightsaber hilts in heavy leather to cover exposed and sparking circuitry. They deployed to the front lines with unpatched blast wounds across their shoulders and deep lacerations on their limbs. The Republic surrendered entire planetary systems, abandoning functioning factories and heavy shipyards to the direct control of the advancing Sith legions. Centuries passed over the muddy and scarred battlefields. The iron braziers at the original Sith camps rusted and collapsed into heaps of orange flakes. Heavy volcanic ash and shifting sands buried the old fortresses. The Sith warriors continually excavated the ruined armories, pulling the black cortosis plates from the dirt and bolting them onto fresh recruits. When a Black Knight fell in combat, another acolyte immediately stepped forward, picked up the dropped lightsaber from the mud, and assumed the exact physical position in the infantry line. They forged new double-bladed axes in the molten furnaces, stamping the ancient Sith runes into the glowing metal heads with heavy hydraulic presses. They rebuilt their ranks continuously, replicating the exact military structure established by the Dark Underlord. The passing generations of dark side practitioners maintained the same level of physical aggression, driving their war droids and heavily armored assault cruisers deeper into Republic space. The Sith commanders eventually directed their combined armadas toward the specific coordinates of the Mizra system. Thousands of heavy cruisers, interceptors, and troop transports gathered in the staging areas, their ion engines glowing brightly against the black vacuum of space. The Black Knights loaded millions of heavily armored acolytes into the landing craft, securing them into the drop seats with thick metal restraints. They stockpiled crates of thermal detonators, high-yield concussion missiles, and concentrated plasma charges in the lower cargo decks. The Sith warlords stood on their command bridges, looking at the tactical readouts displaying the massive Republic defense fleets orbiting the green and blue sphere of Mizra. They gripped the metal railings of the viewing decks and issued the order to advance. The Sith fleet activated their hyperdrives simultaneously, launching the largest concentrated military force of the era directly toward a total collision with the Jedi Order. The Sith Armada dropped out of hyperspace directly above the green and brown continents of Mizra. Hundreds of heavy dreadnoughts fired continuous streams of green turbo-laser plasma down into the planetary atmosphere, striking the Republic orbital defense platforms and sending showers of burning durasteel into the upper thermosphere. Massive landing craft detached from the lower hangar bays of the Sith cruisers, plunging through the cloud cover and deploying thousands of heavily armored troops onto the muddy plains. The Republic Army waited on the surface, arranging their infantry columns behind rows of portable blast shields and heavy repeating blasters. Jedi Knights stood at the front of the Republic lines, holding their ignited blue and green lightsabers over their shoulders and bracing their boots in the wet soil. The ramps of the Sith landing craft slammed into the dirt. The Black Knights charged forward, their black cortosis armor absorbing the incoming blue blaster bolts from the Republic lines. They swung their heavy double-bladed battle axes and red lightsabers, cutting directly through the Republic blast shields and severing the barrels of the repeating cannons. Republic infantrymen dropped their rifles and clutched at deep plasma burns across their chests. The Jedi Knights stepped into the gaps, meeting the charging Sith warriors with swift, calculated strikes. The blades clashed, filling the air with the sharp crackle of superheated energy and scattering bright sparks across the battlefield. The heavy boots of the combatants churned the topsoil into thick, viscous mud, dragging down their movements and coating their armor in brown sludge. Sith war droids advanced behind the infantry, stepping over the fallen bodies on their mechanical treads. They extended long, heavy flamethrowers from their metallic wrists, projecting thick streams of burning liquid across the Republic trenches. The fire burned the damp vegetation and scorched the armor of the Republic soldiers. The Jedi pushed forward through the heat, slicing through the mechanical legs of the war droids and driving their blades into the central power cores. The droids detonated, sending jagged pieces of shrapnel tearing through the surrounding troops. More Sith dropships broke through the cloud cover, landing directly behind the Republic defensive positions and unloading fresh battalions of dark-side acolytes. The Sith forces encircled the Jedi and the Republic soldiers, pressing inward from all sides and restricting the physical space required for the Jedi to execute their combat forms. The vast numbers of the Sith infantry physically overpowered the Jedi defenders. 3 or 4 Black Knights engaged a single Jedi simultaneously, striking from multiple angles with heavy axes and red lightsabers. The Jedi deflected the initial attacks, turning their wrists to parry the overhead strikes, and ducked beneath horizontal sweeps. The continuous barrage of heavy impacts cracked the cortosis plates worn by the Jedi and drained their stamina. Sith acolytes drove the metal hilts of their weapons into the faces of the Jedi, breaking their jawbones and sending them stumbling backward into the mud. The red blades pierced the chests and abdomens of the Jedi Knights, dropping them onto the blood-soaked soil. The Republic infantry lines collapsed entirely under the combined weight of the Sith assault, the surviving soldiers dropping their weapons and running backward through the burning forests. Sith commanders stood on the roofs of their grounded transport ships, pointing their armored gauntlets at the retreating Republic soldiers. Sith snipers knelt on the elevated metal platforms, tracking the targets through their optical scopes and pulling their triggers. The red plasma bolts struck the backs of the retreating soldiers, dropping them face down into the dirt. The Black Knights walked through the center of the battlefield, thrusting their blades into the chests of the wounded Jedi and gathering the dropped blue and green lightsabers from the mud. They clipped the captured weapons to their own heavy utility belts, displaying the metallic cylinders as physical trophies of their immediate victory. The year was exactly 1466 BBY, marking a point over 500 years since Darth Ruin first launched the crusade from the outer fringes of the galaxy. Thick black smoke rose from the burning walkers and mingled with the metallic stench of melted armor over the plains of Mizra. Thousands of Republic soldiers and Jedi Knights lay dead in the trenches. The surviving Republic forces knelt in the mud, their hands bound with heavy iron binders behind their backs. The Black Knights marched these captives toward the cargo bays of the waiting Sith dreadnoughts, striking their shoulders with the heavy metal stocks of their blaster rifles to force them forward. The Sith warlords planted their red banners directly into the center of the battlefield, pressing the metal poles deep into the blood-stained soil. They looked upward at the sky, watching the Republic reinforcement cruisers turning away and jumping back into hyperspace. The slaughter of the Republic forces at Mizra stripped away the final military barricade protecting the core worlds. The Sith warlords ordered their navigation computers recalculated, pointing their expanding armadas directly toward the densely populated central planets. The massive, dome-shaped Senate chamber on Coruscant sat completely silent. Senators gathered their personal dato cards, locked their heavy metal transit trunks, and boarded private transport shuttles bound for the inner core worlds. Thick layers of grey dust settled across the hundreds of floating repulsor pods. The maintenance droids powered down, their internal batteries drained to absolute depletion, leaving the polished durasteel walkways to tarnish under the dim emergency glow lamps. Across the mid-rim and the expansion region, the massive orbital holonet relays sparked and went dark. The thick fiber-optic cables linking planetary communication arrays snapped under the heavy kinetic strain of passing orbital debris. The physical infrastructure of the Galactic Republic fractured into thousands of isolated star systems, leaving the local populations completely cut off from the galactic core. Empty orbital lanes hung above the scattered planets, replacing the once crowded trade routes. The surviving Jedi Knights remained permanently on their stationed worlds, taking direct control of the planetary populations. They walked up the stone steps of the local governance halls and physically occupied the central command chairs. The Knights carved the title of Jedi Lord into the metal plates of their new desks, using the glowing tips of their lightsabers. They stripped off the traditional woven tunics of the Jedi Order, dropping the fabric onto the floorboards. They strapped heavy iron chest plates and thick cortosis gauntlets over their limbs, draping heavy animal pelts over their shoulders to combat the freezing temperatures of the failing planetary power grids. The newly appointed Jedi Lords directed the local laborers to tear down the ruined municipal buildings and haul the massive stone blocks up the steep mountain inclines. They constructed high-walled castles on the rocky cliffs, outfitting the stone parapets with heavy repeating blasters and dropping thick iron portcullises over the main entryways. Inside these keeps, the Jedi Lords sat on heavy wooden thrones. Local farmers and merchants knelt on the cold stone floors, sliding crates of harvested grain and baskets of raw iron ore across the tiles in exchange for direct military protection. The Jedi Lords accepted these physical tributes, storing the resources in the deep subterranean vaults of their castles and locking the heavy vault doors with intricate mechanical tumblers. The Jedi Lords recruited the planetary citizens directly into localized militias. They emptied the municipal armories, handing heavy slug-thrower rifles, iron-tipped vibropikes, and cracked plasteel helmets to the local laborers. They marched these conscripted armies across the muddy agricultural fields, shouting commands and physically adjusting the firing stances of the raw recruits. The Knights rode atop heavily armored local beasts, wrapping the thick leather reins around their gauntlets and patrolling the perimeters of their fiefdoms. Their metallic lightsaber hilts rested cold against their saddles as they surveyed the defensive trenches. The focus of the Jedi shifted entirely to the immediate physical defense of their specific walled territories and the strict enforcement of localized borders. Generations lived and died within the stone walls of these isolated Jedi fiefdoms. When an aging Jedi Lord fell in combat or succumbed to physical illness, their chosen Padawan stepped forward and assumed the title. The new Lord took the wooden throne, wearing the exact same heavy pelts and gripping the exact same lightsaber hilt. The Padawans continued the daily drills, marching the local militias through the trenches and reinforcing the stone walls of the keeps with fresh mortar and heavy iron beams. The communication arrays in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant produced only grey static. The Grand Masters sat in their quiet council chambers, staring at the blank holographic projectors and recording the names of the isolated sectors into the physical archive data tapes. The Sith warlords monitored the dark holonet channels and tracked the localized energy signatures of these distant Jedi strongholds. The Sith kings recognized the physical fragmentation of the Jedi forces across the outer sectors. They commanded their war droids to load heavy siege cannons onto the decks of their assault cruisers. They ordered their Black Knights to sharpen their double-bladed battle axes and prime the plasma charges of their thermal detonators. The Sith warlords directed their armadas away from the major hyperlanes and plotted new navigation coordinates directly toward the towering Jedi castles. They planned to land their dropships in the muddy fields, batter down the iron portcullises, and physically drag the Jedi Lords from their wooden thrones. The scattered Sith factions prepared their invasion fleets, setting the tactical foundations for a massive consolidation of dark-side power under the banner of a single, unified brotherhood. The Sith assault fleets descended upon the fortified Jedi fiefdoms, firing their heavy siege cannons directly into the stone walls of the keeps. The explosive impacts shattered the iron portcullises and sent massive blocks of masonry crashing into the muddy trenches below. The Jedi Lords ignited their lightsabers and led their conscripted militias through the rubble, clashing with the advancing Black Knights in brutal close-quarters combat. The combatants locked blades over the broken walls, driving their boots into the dirt and pushing their physical weight against the enemy lines. Furthermore, a new and lethal element arrived alongside the Sith drop pods. Sith mercenaries carrying infected rations and contaminated water supplies inadvertently introduced the Kandorian plague directly into the besieged planetary systems. The microscopic pathogen spread rapidly through the dense ranks of the clashing armies, transferring through open wounds, shared canteens, and the thick, blood-soaked mud of the battlefields. The physical effects of the plague manifested quickly among the soldiers. Thick black veins bulged beneath the skin of their necks and arms, and severe hemorrhaging filled their lungs with blood. Republic militiamen dropped their slug-thrower rifles and collapsed onto the stone floors of the castles, coughing violently and clutching their chests. The Sith acolytes suffered identical symptoms, their bodies seizing and spasming inside their heavy cortosis armor plates. The infantry formations physically dissolved as entire battalions died in the dirt before they could even fire their weapons. The Jedi Lords walked through their fortress wards, utilizing their force-healing techniques to purge the infection from individual patients. The sheer volume of infected citizens completely overwhelmed the physical limits of the Jedi. Consequently, the death toll climbed exponentially, leaving the castle courtyards and the Sith encampments choked with thousands of unburied corpses. The plague spread beyond the planetary surfaces and infiltrated the orbital fleets. Pilots and navigators collapsed over their control consoles, their hands slipping from the flight yokes and acceleration levers. Massive Sith dreadnoughts and Republic medical frigates drifted aimlessly out of their designated flight paths, colliding with one another in the vacuum of space. The metal hulls breached upon impact, venting atmosphere, cargo, and frozen bodies directly into the void. Supply chains collapsed entirely across the affected sectors. Cargo haulers packed with grain and raw coaxium sat abandoned on the docking pads, their engines rusting and their cargo bays untouched. Local scavengers attempted to pry open the heavy metal doors of the grounded ships, contracting the pathogen from the contaminated surfaces and dying directly beside the landing struts. The surviving Jedi Lords initiated extreme quarantine measures. They sealed the heavy iron blast doors of their inner keeps and refused entry to anyone exhibiting physical signs of the infection. They ordered their remaining healthy militiamen to construct massive wooden pyres in the outer courtyards. The soldiers dragged the infected bodies through the mud, stacked the corpses onto the timber, and ignited the piles with heavy flamethrowers. Thick, Black smoke rose from the burning mounds, carrying the smell of charred flesh and scorched fabric over the stone battlements. The Sith warlords mirrored these brutal containment protocols. They vented the infected lower decks of their starships directly into space, flushing hundreds of sick acolytes out of the airlocks to preserve the health of the command crews. They isolated themselves inside their private chambers, sterilizing their armored gauntlets with chemical washes and breathing exclusively through high-grade mechanical filtration masks. The combination of continuous warfare and biological devastation physically reduced the Galactic Republic to a fraction of its former size. The borders contracted inward, abandoning thousands of mid-rim and outer-rim worlds to complete physical ruin. Entire planetary populations died out, leaving massive ecumenopolises completely devoid of living inhabitants. Wind and rain eroded the durasteel structures of the abandoned cities, collapsing the skyscrapers and flooding the transit tunnels with debris. The military campaigns ground to a halt, locking the remaining Jedi and Sith forces into an exhausted stalemate. The warlords and the Jedi lords stared across the devastated landscapes, clutching their weapons with trembling, fatigued hands. The remaining armies required a massive influx of fresh recruits and a completely restructured command hierarchy to break the centuries-long gridlock. Deep within the core systems, a highly skilled and exceptionally charismatic Jedi Master watched the physical deterioration of the Republic forces with intense scrutiny. He analyzed the fractured state of the Sith warlords and recognized the precise military vulnerabilities created by their constant infighting. He polished his lightsaber hilt and studied the tactical maps of the surviving Sith territories, calculating the exact amount of physical force and strategic manipulation required to forge the warring dark-side factions into a single, unstoppable military machine. Jedi Master Skere Khan stood inside the tactical command center of the Coruscant Jedi Temple. He leaned heavily over a massive circular holotable, bathing his face and chest in the harsh blue light of the projected galaxy map. He traced the glowing red borders of the Sith territories with his index finger, following the jagged lines across the outer rim. He watched the crimson holographic markers of the scattered Sith warlords physically clashing against one another. He observed the blue markers representing the Republic fleets, pulling back toward the core worlds. Khan released the clasps on his heavy cortosis chest plate and dropped the armor onto the metal floor grates, producing a loud clang that echoed off the stone walls. He detached his standard Jedi communicator from his utility belt, threw it to the ground, and crushed the small metal cylinder beneath the heel of his boot. He turned his body away from the holotable and walked down the stone corridors of the temple. He kept his eyes fixed strictly forward on the heavy blast doors of the hangar bay. He boarded a sleek Republic interceptor, engaged the sublight engines, and piloted the ship up through the Coruscant atmosphere, setting his navigation computer directly for the Sith-controlled world of Rune. The interceptor reverted from hyperspace above the rocky, canyon-scarred surface of Rune. Khan piloted his ship down through the thick cloud cover, landing the vessel directly in the center of a massive, heavily fortified Sith military encampment. The landing gear crushed the wooden supply crates and kicked up thick clouds of brown dust. Hundreds of Sith acolytes and mercenaries raised their heavy blaster rifles and iron-tipped vibropikes, surrounding the interceptor in a tight circle. Khan lowered the boarding ramp and walked down onto the packed dirt. He ignited his lightsaber, holding the blue blade loosely at his side. He extended his left hand and projected a massive wave of telekinetic force, throwing the front line of armored guards backward into the stone walls of the barracks. The impact cracked their breastplates and shattered the wooden support beams of the buildings. He stepped over their groaning bodies and marched straight toward the central obsidian keep. He slashed his lightsaber through the heavy iron doors, kicking the glowing molten metal inward, and entered the main council chamber. 7 heavily armored Sith warlords sat around a large stone table, gripping their weapons in the dim light of flickering oil lamps. They turned their sulphurous yellow eyes toward Khan as he stepped into the room. The largest warlord, wearing thick plates of bleached bone and rusted iron, charged across the room and swung a massive heavy axe directly at Khan's head. Khan sidestepped the heavy blow, allowing the axe to smash into the stone floor, and drove his lightsaber through the warlord's chest plate. The massive Sith collapsed onto the tiles, filling the air with the smell of scorched fabric and seared flesh. Khan powered down his blue lightsaber and released the latch on his belt, dropping the weapon onto the warlord's body. He lifted a red-bladed Sith lightsaber from the table and ignited the weapon, casting a crimson glare across his face. He pointed the red blade at the remaining 6 warlords, demanding their absolute submission to his command. The warlords looked at the smoking body of their strongest rival, placed their weapons on the stone table, and knelt on the floor. Khan restructured the entire hierarchy of the Sith factions into a singular, tightly bound organization. He named this new coalition the Brotherhood of Darkness. He replaced the tradition of constant assassinations over the supreme leadership position by granting the title of Dark Lord of the Sith equally to all the surviving warlords. He ordered the leaders to stand shoulder to shoulder on an elevated stone balcony overlooking the vast military camps. He handed each warlord a heavy black cloak and a thick iron medallion bearing the newly forged crest of the Brotherhood. He commanded the leaders to fight as a single unit, promising to scorch any soldier who struck an ally to ash with concentrated bursts of Force lightning. The warlords draped the heavy cloaks over their shoulders and wore the iron medallions around their necks, officially pooling their individual armadas and stockpiled resources into one unified military force. The labor droids in the lower levels of the fortress melted down the customized individual banners and personalized armor of the previous fiefdoms. They poured the liquid iron into hydraulic presses, stamping out thousands of identical suits of heavy black armor for the infantry. The acolytes painted the unified crest of the Brotherhood of Darkness onto the durasteel bulkheads of their assault cruisers. They connected their individual fuel reserves through heavy rubber hoses, pumping the raw coaxium into the massive tanks of the central dreadnoughts. Khan stood on the command bridge of his newly constructed flagship, wearing a sleek black tunic and a heavy cape. He observed thousands of identical, wedge-shaped warships aligning in perfect formation outside the thick transperisteel viewport. He raised his hand and pointed his index finger toward the specific coordinates of the Republic core worlds. He issued the command to jump to hyperspace, launching a massive, perfectly coordinated Sith armada to crush the exhausted Jedi Lords and conquer the remaining sectors of the Galactic Republic. The Brotherhood of Darkness assault fleets dropped out of hyperspace above the rocky, canyon-scarred surface of the planet Ruusan. Thousands of heavily armored dreadnoughts and nimble interceptors filled the orbit, blocking out the light of the sun and casting massive dark shadows over the barren plains below. The Sith commanders initiated their planetary bombardments, firing continuous volleys of green plasma directly into the Jedi encampments. The heavy turbo-laser blasts shattered the stone battlements of the Jedi keeps and set the surrounding forests ablaze. The Jedi Lords rushed out of their command tents, igniting their lightsabers and shouting orders over the deafening roar of the artillery fire. They directed their conscripted militias into the deep trenches, pulling the heavy blast shields over the dirt walls and bracing their slug-thrower rifles against the incoming fire. The Sith landing craft deployed onto the dusty plains, the metal ramps slamming heavily into the dry earth. Legions of Black Knights charged forward, their black cortosis armor absorbing the kinetic impacts of the Jedi defensive fire. They swung their double-bladed battle axes and red lightsabers, tearing through the metal blast shields and severing the barrels of the repeating cannons. The Jedi Lords stepped forward to meet them, clashing their blue and green blades against the crimson weapons of the Sith. The combatants locked blades over the muddy trenches, driving their boots into the dirt and pushing their physical weight against the enemy lines. Lord Khan stood on a high stone ridge overlooking the battlefield, observing the physical devastation with cold calculation. He directed his commanders to target the weakest points of the Jedi defenses, ordering localized orbital strikes to wipe out entire battalions of Republic infantrymen. The Jedi High Council on Coruscant recognized the imminent threat posed by the massive Sith armada. They mobilized their remaining reserve forces, loading thousands of fully trained Jedi Knights and heavily armed Republic soldiers onto a fleet of transport cruisers. The Republic Armada arrived in the Ruusan system, engaging the Sith blockade in a brutal ship-to-ship battle. The Republic interceptors weaved through the green plasma fire of the Sith dreadnoughts, launching concentrated volleys of proton torpedoes into the massive thruster banks of the enemy cruisers. The damaged Sith warships lost orbital stability, plummeting through the atmosphere and crashing violently into the planetary surface. The physical impact of the crashing dreadnoughts created massive craters in the rock and sent shockwaves rippling through the opposing armies. The Republic transports pushed through the debris field, deploying their reinforcements directly into the center of the ongoing ground battle. The introduction of the Republic reinforcements temporarily stabilized the Jedi front lines. The newly arrived knights charged out of their landing craft, their lightsabers humming loudly as they engaged the Black Knights in close-quarters combat. The battle expanded across the entire continent, reducing the once pristine valleys into barren, crater-pocked wastelands. The continuous bombardment pulverized the bedrock, turning the surface of Ruusan into a vast, dusty desert. The combatants fought through extreme physical exhaustion, their armor plates dented and scorched by the relentless plasma fire. The Jedi healers established field hospitals in the deep cavern systems, wrapping Bacta patches over severed limbs and administering stim packs to the critically wounded. The Sith commanders completely ignored their own casualties, executing any acolyte who attempted to retreat and forcing the remaining soldiers to march over the broken bodies of their fallen allies. The Battle of Ruusan dragged on for several grueling months, resulting in massive casualties on both sides. The physical attrition rate heavily favored the Sith, their vast reserves of conscripted mercenaries allowing them to continuously replenish their frontline infantry. Lord Khan utilized his supreme command to execute complex tactical maneuvers, isolating and destroying the Jedi battalions one by one. The Jedi Council commanders realized that conventional military tactics would not secure a definitive victory against the unified Brotherhood of Darkness. They required a drastic shift in strategy to physically break the Sith blockade and permanently dismantle the Darkside army. They established a temporary command center in the deepest trench, laying out physical maps of the Sith encampments and carefully analyzing the troop movements of the enemy forces. They prepared to launch a massive, coordinated counteroffensive, setting the physical foundation for the final, decisive confrontation of the new Sith Wars. The Jedi Council commanders mapped out a massive military initiative they called the Army of Light. They dispatched couriers to the isolated Jedi fiefdoms, delivering the new mobilization orders on heavily encrypted datapads. The couriers walked into the stone keeps and handed the devices directly to the Jedi Lords. The localized leaders read the instructions, deactivated the defense grids around their castles, and ordered their militias to break camp. The Jedi Lords marched their conscripted farmers and local security forces onto heavy troop transports, packing the cargo holds with slug-thrower rifles and iron-tipped pikes. They aimed their navigation arrays toward the core worlds, answering the Council's call to unify their scattered forces against the Brotherhood of Darkness. A towering Jedi Master named Hoth stepped forward to command the newly formed Army of Light. He wore heavy plates of raw cortosis strapped across his chest and shoulders, and a thick grey beard covered his jawline. He carried a massive blue lightsaber with a heavily modified, elongated hilt designed specifically for two-handed strikes. General Hoth stood at the center of the Coruscant Command Center, directly addressing the thousands of Jedi Lords and Republic military officers who filled the assembly hall. He slammed his armored fist against the holotable, detailing a singular objective: to confront the Brotherhood of Darkness directly on the planet Ruusan and entirely annihilate the Sith army in one concentrated battle. He ordered the Republic quartermasters to load every available medical crate, ration pack, and plasma charge onto the waiting capital ships. The Army of Light launched from the Coruscant shipyards, consisting of hundreds of massive Republic dreadnoughts and thousands of smaller assault cruisers. They dropped out of hyperspace above the cratered, barren surface of Ruusan. The Republic gunships deployed through the heavy atmospheric dust, landing directly in the wide valleys between the jagged mountain ranges. General Hoth marched his legions out of the landing craft, deploying his heavy artillery batteries along the ridgelines and positioning his infantry columns in the deep ravines. The Jedi Knights ignited their blue and green lightsabers, forming an impenetrable wall of superheated plasma at the front of the Republic lines. Lord Khan observed the massive Republic deployment from his own command tent, watching the optical readouts display the sheer volume of the enemy forces. He ordered the Black Knights to advance, sending thousands of dark-side acolytes charging across the dusty plains. The two massive armies collided with tremendous physical force. The Jedi Knights swung their blades through the heavy black armor of the Sith warriors, while the Black Knights returned fire with point-blank blaster volleys and heavy axe strikes. The combatants locked themselves into brutal hand-to-hand engagements, driving their boots into the dust and throwing each other against the jagged rocks. General Hoth waded directly into the center of the fighting, his massive blue lightsaber tearing through the Sith infantry lines. He targeted the highest-ranking Sith commanders, physically overpowering them and leaving their scorched armor plates on the battlefield. The Republic artillery rained heavy proton torpedoes down on the Sith positions, shattering their blast shields and blasting deep craters into the dry earth. The relentless assault forced the Brotherhood of Darkness to retreat from the open plains and pull their surviving forces back into the deep, subterranean cave networks. Lord Khan paced back and forth across the floor of the central Sith cavern, listening to the continuous Republic artillery bombardment striking the rock ceiling above them. The other Dark Lords sat around the command table, examining their damaged weapons and clutching at deep blaster wounds. Khan recognized that his forces lacked the physical numbers and the strategic positioning to win a conventional ground war against the Army of Light. He ordered his commanders to stop all defensive preparations and instructed them to gather the entire surviving Sith army in the lowest chamber of the cave system. He pulled a dusty, triangular Sith holocron from his heavy robes, tracing his fingers over the glowing red runes etched into the crystalline surface. He detailed a final, absolute measure designed to physically eradicate the entire Jedi army, preparing to utilize an ancient dark side ritual that required the complete, focused energy of every living Sith in the Brotherhood. The remaining Sith Lords and their surviving acolytes marched down the spiraling stone staircases, moving deeper into the subterranean tunnels beneath the Ruusan's surface. They left their heavy blaster rifles and double-bladed battle axes leaning against the damp cavern walls. They removed their black cortosis armor plates, leaving the heavy metal piled on the rocky floor, and walked forward, wearing only their dark synth leather tunics. Thousands of Sith gathered in the lowest chamber, a massive domed cave illuminated entirely by the red glow of their ignited lightsabers. Lord Khan stood at the direct center of the chamber, holding the triangular crystalline holocron high above his head. He ordered his followers to form concentric circles around him, locking their arms together and pressing their shoulders tightly against one another. He instructed them to completely open their minds to the dark side and channel their collective anger and hatred directly into the physical space between them. Khan recited the ancient Sith incantations etched into the holocron, his harsh voice echoing off the damp stone walls. The surrounding acolytes repeated the chants, their voices merging into a single, deafening drone. The physical temperature in the cavern dropped drastically, freezing the moisture on the rock walls into thick sheets of white frost. A swirling sphere of pure, concentrated dark side energy began to form directly above Khan's outstretched hands. The sphere expanded outward, pulling the red light from the ignited lightsabers and absorbing the physical vitality of the chanting Sith warriors. The acolytes dropped to their knees, their skin turning pale and their eyes rolling back as the ritual physically drained the life force from their bodies. Khan maintained his stance in the center, struggling to control the rapidly expanding mass of pure destruction, known as the Thought Bomb. General Hoth led a strike team of 100 heavily armed Jedi Knights into the cavern network. They moved quickly through the upper tunnels, their blue and green lightsabers cutting through the remaining blast doors and illuminating the discarded piles of Sith armor. They descended the spiral stone steps, their boots crunching against the loose gravel. Hoth pushed through the final archway and stepped into the massive lower chamber. He raised his elongated lightsaber, pointing the blue blade directly at Lord Khan and the swirling, unstable sphere of dark energy. The Jedi Knights fanned out along the perimeter of the cavern, raising their weapons and preparing to strike. Khan looked at Hoth, a wide grin stretching across his pale face. He dropped his arms and intentionally released his physical control over the contained energy. The thought bomb detonated. The sphere collapsed inward for a fraction of a second before violently expanding outward in a blinding flash of silver and purple light. The physical shockwave ripped through the cavern, instantly disintegrating the stone walls and vaporizing the subterranean lakes. The blast engulfed Lord Khan and the thousands of kneeling Sith acolytes, instantly stripping the flesh from their bones and turning their physical forms into fine grey ash. The expanding wave of dark energy hit General Hoth and the Jedi strike team, shattering their cortosis chest plates and instantly consuming their physical bodies. The explosion completely erased all physical matter within the cavern system, leaving nothing but a massive, perfectly spherical void deep beneath the planetary crust. The localized destruction completely wiped out the entire active command structure of both the Brotherhood of Darkness and the Army of Light in a single, absolute physical event. The physical detonation of the thought bomb fundamentally altered the surface of Ruusan. Massive sinkholes collapsed the surrounding valleys, swallowing the abandoned Republic artillery batteries and the crushed Sith landing craft. The remaining Republic forces on the surface felt the heavy seismic tremors roll beneath their boots. They lowered their blaster rifles and looked toward the center of the battlefield, watching a massive column of dust and debris shoot up into the atmosphere. The surviving Sith mercenaries dropped their weapons in the mud, turning their backs on the Republic lines and running toward the scattered, damaged transport ships. The battle ended not with a strategic military surrender, but with the sudden, total physical annihilation of the primary combatants. High above the planet, the Republic admirals analyzed the sudden drop in energy signatures from the surface. They dispatched scout ships to scan the remaining Sith armada. The Sith cruisers drifted aimlessly in orbit, their command bridges completely vacant, and their weapon systems powered down. The Republic forces slowly pushed forward, physically boarding the empty dreadnoughts and securing the planetary airspace. The thousand-year conflict, known as the New Sith Wars, effectively terminated in the ash and dust of Ruusan. The Galactic Republic began the massive physical effort of dismantling the remaining Sith infrastructure, completely unaware that a single, solitary Sith Lord had survived the detonation, walking away from the destruction with a new, deeply hidden philosophy designed to rebuild the dark side in absolute secrecy. A towering warrior emerged from the subterranean tunnels beneath the Ruusan surface, stepping through a melted blast door and walking out into the settling grey ash. He wore heavy black armor plates and a thick leather cloak. Dark, intricate tattoos covered his bald scalp, framing his deep yellow eyes. This man, Darth Bane, marched across the blast zone of the detonated weapon. He stepped directly onto the petrified, grey husks of the fallen Sith and Jedi. The fragile ash forms collapsed into powder beneath his heavy metal boots. He collected the cracked, discarded lightsabers from the dirt and examined the broken firing mechanisms of the ruined Republic blasters. He surveyed the scorched earth, looking at the pulverized stone fortresses and the completely flattened military encampments. Bane pulled a small, triangular holocron from his utility belt and activated the recording mechanism. He held the glowing red crystal in his palm, letting the crimson light illuminate the dark ink on his face. He dictated a new physical framework directly into the device. He spoke about the physical consequences of the Brotherhood of Darkness, detailing how the thousands of squabbling acolytes turned their blades against their own commanders and drained the raw combat effectiveness of the army. He recorded a strict limitation on the total number of darkside practitioners. He mandated a hierarchy consisting of exactly 2 individuals. He designated one master to hoard and wield the physical power of the dark side, and one apprentice to continuously study and crave that exact same power. He deactivated the holocron, watching the red light fade, and secured the crystalline device back onto his leather belt. Bane continued his march toward the outer edges of the blast zone, searching the surviving camps for a suitable candidate to fulfill the second role of his new hierarchy. He walked into a small clearing surrounded by charred trees and overturned Republic transport speeders. 2 Republic mercenary scouts lay dead on the cracked soil. Their heavy plasteel chest plates were crushed inward, and their necks were bent at sharp, unnatural angles. A young girl stood directly between the 2 corpses. She wore torn, dirt-stained civilian garments, and her blonde hair hung in matted clumps across her forehead. Her hands trembled, and her irises glowed with a bright, sulphurous yellow light. She breathed heavily, inhaling the thick scent of charred wood and burning ozone. Bane stopped at the edge of the clearing and observed the crushed armor of the dead scouts. He analyzed the heavy, blunt force trauma and identified it as the direct result of raw telekinetic strikes. He approached the girl, his armored boots leaving deep tracks in the mud. He stopped directly in front of her and extended his heavy, gauntleted hand. He stated his title as Dark Lord of the Sith and offered her the position of his sole apprentice. The girl looked at the dead mercenaries, turned her head toward Bane, and placed her small, dirt-covered hand directly into his heavy metal gauntlet. She adopted the name Darth Zana, physically cementing the two-person hierarchy of the Sith. The master and his new apprentice turned their backs on the ruined valleys of Ruusan. They walked across the rocky plains toward a small, undamaged scout ship resting inside a deep, narrow ravine. They walked up the metal boarding ramp and entered the cramped cockpit. Bane sat in the pilot's chair, pressing a sequence of heavy rectangular buttons on the navigation console. He powered up the sublight engines and engaged the cloaking mechanisms, entirely masking their heat signatures and exhaust trails from the Republic orbital scanners. The ship lifted off the ground, broke through the planetary atmosphere, and jumped into hyperspace. Down on the surface, the surviving Republic forces gathered the wounded soldiers and began melting down their own heavy armor plates in the portable plasma furnaces, simultaneously dipping their metal styluses into ink to draft physical treaties that would dissolve the standing army and completely demilitarize the Galactic Republic. Bane piloted his stealth ship back into the dense atmosphere of an uncharted moon in the deep core. He landed the vessel inside a dark, humid cave system and lowered the boarding ramp. He and Zana walked down onto the slick, moss-covered stone floor. Bane handed his apprentice a heavy metal datapad containing the foundational texts of his newly established Rule of Two. He instructed Zana to completely memorize the rigid doctrine, explicitly limiting the physical manifestation of the dark side to only two living beings. He ordered her to physically execute any other dark side practitioner she encountered, ensuring the complete monopoly of their specific lineage. Zana took the datapad, her yellow eyes scanning the glowing red text. She attached the heavy metal device to her utility belt and ignited a short, single-bladed red lightsaber, turning her attention strictly toward mastering her physical combat forms. The Republic admirals and Jedi generals finalized the Ruusan Reformation inside the massive Senate chambers on Coruscant. The Supreme Chancellor struck his heavy wooden gavel against the podium, officially disbanding the centralized Republic military structure. He ordered the complete physical disarmament of the Republic dreadnought fleet. Thousands of maintenance droids boarded the heavy assault cruisers in the Coruscant orbital dry docks. They used plasma torches to slice the heavy turbo laser batteries from the armored hulls and stripped the reinforced cortosis plating from the primary command decks. The massive warships were permanently decommissioned, their stripped fuselages converted into civilian cargo haulers and diplomatic transport vessels. The Republic physically surrendered its capacity to wage a galactic war, relying entirely on the individual planetary defense forces to maintain local security. The Jedi Council formally renounced all active military ranks and political titles. The surviving Jedi Lords abandoned their stone keeps and walled fiefdoms across the outer rim. They unbolted their heavy iron chest plates and cortosis gauntlets, leaving the battle-scarred armor piled in the central courtyards. They returned to Coruscant wearing only simple, unarmored woven tunics and plain leather boots. The Jedi submitted themselves entirely to the direct oversight of the Republic Senate. They handed their tactical holomaps and military encryption codes directly over to the civilian administration, They returned exclusively to their original roles as peacekeepers and mediators, intentionally placing their physical strength under strict legislative control to prevent the resurgence of another militant Jedi faction. Darth Bane observed the physical demilitarization of the Republic through the encrypted holonet feeds inside his hidden cave. He watched the massive Republic dreadnoughts being dismantled and recorded the official dissolution of the Jedi command structure. He instructed Zana to completely mask her physical connection to the dark side. He ordered her to walk through the crowded marketplaces of the core worlds, wearing unmarked civilian clothing and hiding her lightsaber hilt deep inside her leather satchel. He taught her to manipulate the local politicians and wealthy merchants using subtle mind tricks and falsified electronic credit transfers. Bane mandated that the Sith must entirely abandon the physical battlefields, operating exclusively from the deep shadows and focusing their efforts on the slow, methodical corruption of the Republic infrastructure. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant returned to a state of quiet, uninterrupted study. The younglings sat on woven meditation mats in the training courtyards, practicing basic telekinetic lifts with small wooden spheres. The elder masters walked through the grand archives, organizing the new data tapes containing the official records of the Ruusan Reformation. They locked the physical artifacts recovered from the battlefield, the cracked Sith helmets, the melted battle axes, and the scorched red lightsabers, deep inside the lowest containment vaults. The Jedi High Council looked at the glowing blue projection of the galaxy map, completely devoid of any red Sith markers. They declared the 1,000-year conflict permanently resolved and recorded the absolute extinction of the Sith Order in the official Jedi archives. Decades passed, turning the physical reality of the new Sith Wars into distant historical records. The massive craters on Ruusan filled with rainwater, creating a series of deep, stagnant lakes. The shattered stone keeps of the Jedi Lords eroded under the heavy winds, collapsing into piles of loose rubble covered in thick green moss. The citizens of the Republic traveled freely along the unrestricted hyperlanes, establishing new trade routes and expanding the massive ecumenopolises. The heavy scars of the war physically faded from the surface of the galaxy. Deep in the uncharted regions of space, the hidden lineage of Darth Bane continued. The Master passed his absolute power directly to the apprentice, waiting patiently for the exact moment when the Republic would completely forget the physical threat of the dark side. Darth Bane and Darth Zana established their base of operations on the rocky, wind-swept surface of the planet Ambria. They lived inside a simple mud-brick hut, utilizing a small wood-burning stove to heat the single room. Bane instructed Zana in the physical application of the dark side, directing her to lift heavy boulders from the surrounding plains and hurl them into the deep canyons. He handed her thick, leather-bound books and triangular crystalline holocrons stolen from the ancient ruins. Zana read the glowing red text by the light of the fire, memorizing the specific chemical formulas for lethal toxins and the precise hand gestures required for advanced telekinetic strikes. They wore plain, dust-covered cloaks, matching the exact visual appearance of the local transient miners and scavengers when they traveled to the nearby trading outposts to purchase food canisters and power cells. The succession of the Sith lineage occurred through direct physical violence. An apprentice challenged the master, igniting a red lightsaber and driving the superheated kyber blade through the elder's chest. The victorious apprentice took the heavy iron keys to the hidden vaults, claimed the glowing holocrons, and immediately sought out a fresh, physically capable recruit to continue the cycle. Successive generations of Sith Lords left the harsh environments of the Outer Rim and relocated directly to the affluent sectors of the core worlds. They purchased high-rise luxury apartments on Coruscant and Alderaan, leaving their heavy armor plates and dark cloaks in locked chests. They wore tailored silk suits and velvet robes, walking across the polished marble floors of corporate boardrooms and carrying heavy metal briefcases filled with blank platinum ingots. These hidden dark side practitioners focused their efforts on acquiring physical assets and establishing vast financial networks. They signed localized trade contracts with the major mining guilds, gaining direct operational control over the massive coaxium extraction facilities on Kessel and the heavy durasteel foundries on Fondor. The Sith Lords manipulated the physical supply chains of the galaxy, purposefully routing shipments of medical supplies and food rations away from the Outer Rim territories and funneling the cargo into the private warehouses of corrupt planetary governors. They met with heavily armed pirate captains and mercenary leaders in the dimly lit basements of lower-level cantinas, sliding leather pouches of Republic credits across the metal tables to fund localized uprisings and planetary blockades. The Jedi Knights on Coruscant stared at the holographic distress beacons blinking from these localized combat zones. They boarded their diplomatic cruisers and traveled to the blockaded planets, stepping onto the durasteel landing pads to negotiate directly with the pirate captains. The Knights ignited their green and blue lightsabers to deflect incoming blaster fire from local smugglers, arresting the visible combatants and transporting them to the Republic detention facilities. The Jedi returned to their temple and sat on their woven meditation mats, breathing deeply and documenting the physical capture of these criminals in the official archives. They walked past the sealed containment vaults, holding the scorched Sith battle axes and cracked helmets, leaving the heavy iron blast doors firmly locked. The physical distance between the Jedi peacekeepers and the corporate power brokers allowed the Sith to operate right beside the core of the Republic government. The Sith Lords utilized their immense financial leverage to infiltrate the political infrastructure of the Galactic Republic. They invited key senators to lavish banquets in their high-rise apartments, serving rare, imported meats and pouring thick, dark wine into crystal goblets. They handed over heavy datapads containing the encrypted routing numbers to off-world banking accounts, directly purchasing the legislative votes required to rewrite the laws governing the major hyperspace trade routes. The Sith filled massive underground vaults with heavy crates of raw coaxium and stacks of physical credits, allowing them to construct massive, automated weapon factories completely isolated from the official grid. Labor droids stamped out thousands of identical blaster rifles and heavy artillery cannons inside these hidden facilities, stacking the weapons into massive metal shipping crates. A prominent Sith Lord stood on the balcony of his Coruscant penthouse, holding a crystal goblet in his right hand. He looked through the thick transparasteel glass at the massive dome-shaped Senate building glowing brightly under the city lights. He reached into the pocket of his tailored silk jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted communicator. He pressed his thumb against the activation stud, connecting the frequency directly to a hidden staging ground in the unknown regions. He issued a series of rapid, coded commands to his planetary governors and corporate executives, directing them to initiate the next sequence of trade embargoes. The physical pieces of the grand design shifted precisely into place, setting the foundation to physically choke the Republic supply lines and crash the galactic economy. Darth Tenebrous paced back and forth across the polished metal deck of his private starship, gripping the silver hilt of his lightsaber tightly in his right hand. He stared out the heavy transparasteel viewports, watching the dense star fields of the core worlds slide past the reinforced glass. He analyzed the physical results of the grand plan, observing how his predecessors had successfully infiltrated the Republic banking clans and entirely bypassed the Jedi Order. He recognized a severe limitation in the physical lifespan of the Sith Lords. He reasoned that no matter how much wealth or political influence a master accumulated, the inevitable decay of their physical body ultimately handed all their hard-earned power directly over to the apprentice. Tenebrous pulled a datapad from his silk robes and tapped the screen, scrolling through complex biological equations and detailed anatomical readouts of various alien species. He plotted a direct course for the planet Bith, preparing to utilize his immense wealth to forcibly accelerate his own genetic research and physically overwrite the limitations of his own mortality. Tenebrous directed the labor droids to construct a massive subterranean laboratory beneath the crust of a remote moon. They installed heavy durasteel bulkheads and thick, blast-proof glass isolation chambers. They wired complex life support monitors and high-capacity blood filtration units directly into the main power grid. Tenebrous stood in the center of the sterilized room, wearing a thick white lab coat over his dark tunics. He supervised the extraction of midichlorians from living test subjects, watching the medical droids insert heavy metal needles directly into the spinal columns of captive mercenaries. The clear plastic tubes filled with dark red blood, pumping the fluid directly into the centrifuge processes. Tenebrous calibrated the microscopic lasers, slicing the genetic material apart and attempting to physically isolate the specific biological markers that generated a connection to the dark side of the Force. He threw the failed experiments into the incinerator chutes, pushing the heavy metal levers forward to burn the physical evidence of his failures. His apprentice, Darth Plagueis, stood in the corner of the laboratory, observing the continuous biological trials with strict, unblinking focus. Plagueis wore a dark, heavy cloak that completely covered his tall, slender moon physique. He watched his master adjust the dials on the blood processors, analyzing the exact chemical ratios and the specific energy frequencies utilized in the experiments. Plagueis recognized the physical flaws in his master's methodology. He saw how Tenebrous relied entirely on the physical manipulation of existing cells, entirely ignoring the broader, energetic currents of the Force itself. Plagueis stepped forward and suggested utilizing concentrated dark side energy to directly shock the dying cells back into a state of rapid replication. Tenebrous turned his large black eyes toward his apprentice, tightening his grip on the edge of the metal examination table and sharply ordering Plagueis to remain completely silent and strictly observe the established physical protocols. The tension between the master and apprentice manifested entirely through physical proximity and sharp, aggressive movements. When they traveled together to the mining world of Baldemnik to inspect a newly acquired cortosis extraction facility, they walked several paces apart. They wore heavy environmental suits to protect themselves from the toxic atmosphere, their boots crunching loudly against the loose, rocky soil. Tenebrous walked to the edge of a deep mining shaft, leaning over the metal railing to inspect the massive rotary drills cutting through the bedrock. Plagueis stepped quietly behind his master, his hands resting on the metal clasps of his utility belt. He looked up at the ceiling of the cavern, observing a massive cluster of heavy rocks, precariously balanced above the drilling platform. He calculated the exact physical trajectory and the necessary telekinetic force required to dislodge the heavy boulders. Plagueis extended his hand and projected a massive, concentrated burst of dark side energy directly into the cavern ceiling. The heavy rocks snapped loose from the rock face, dropping instantly toward the metal platform. Tenebrous looked up, raising his hands to deflect the falling debris. The massive boulders smashed through his telekinetic shield, crushing his heavy environmental suit and pinning his body directly against the iron grates of the platform. Plagueis walked slowly toward his trapped master, looking down at the cracked visor and the leaking oxygen tubes. Tenebrous gasped for air, his hands scrambling against the heavy rocks pressing down on his chest. Plagueis knelt beside his master, placing his hand gently on the broken armor plating. He watched the physical life drain from Tenebrous, analyzing the exact moment the master's midi-chlorian count dropped to 0. Plagueis stood up, smoothing the front of his dark cloak, and walked back toward the landing pad, claiming the absolute title of Dark Lord of the Sith, and taking direct control of the massive corporate empire his master had built. Darth Plagueis utilized his master's vast fortune to construct a private sanctuary on the heavily forested planet of Sojourn. He ordered the construction droids to build a massive, multi-tiered facility directly into the side of a steep mountain overlooking a deep saltwater lake. The droids poured thick durasteel foundations and installed heavy transparasteel viewports along the upper observation decks. Plagueis filled the lower levels entirely with state-of-the-art medical equipment, dragging heavy cloning cylinders, Bacta tanks, and automated surgical tables into the sterile white rooms. He wore a dark, form-fitting tunic and black boots, walking through the facility and manually adjusting the temperature controls on the heavy stasis pods. He directed his financial managers to purchase thousands of rare, exotic animals from the Outer Rim, locking the creatures into reinforced metal cages lined along the laboratory walls. Plagueis ignored the ancient Sith holocrons stored in his master's vault. He turned his attention entirely to the physical manipulation of biology, convinced that the key to eternal life lay in the direct control of cellular structure. He strapped the exotic animals to the metal examination tables, securing their limbs with heavy leather restraints. He injected highly concentrated, synthesized dark side energy directly into their bloodstreams using thick hypodermic needles. He observed the physical reactions closely, watching the creatures spasm and convulse as the energy forced their cells to rapidly regenerate. He recorded the precise measurements on his datapad, noting the exact dosages required to heal deep physical lacerations and reverse the effects of lethal neurotoxins. He pushed the experiments further, attempting to use the dark side to forcefully reanimate the bodies of the animals after they had completely physically expired. To execute his political goals, Plagueis maintained the public persona of Higo Damask, a powerful and reclusive Muun financial magnate. He traveled to Coruscant on his private luxury yacht, landing on the exclusive executive docking pads. He walked into the grand meeting halls of the intergalactic banking clan, carrying a heavy platinum cane and speaking in a smooth, calculated tone. He sat across the long, polished wood tables from Republic senators and planetary governors, offering massive financial loans and negotiating exclusive trade monopolies. He physically handed over encrypted data cards containing the routing numbers for billions of credits, utilizing the vast wealth to quietly buy controlling stakes in major starship manufacturing corporations and planetary security forces. Plagueis physically constructed a massive web of debt and obligation, slowly pulling the highest levels of the Republic government directly under his absolute financial control. During a business trip to the planet Naboo, Plagueis observed a young, charismatic human named Palpatine interacting with local politicians in the public squares. Plagueis noted the young man's sharp intellect and subtle manipulation of the political arguments. He arranged a private meeting in a heavily guarded, soundproofed room at the center of the capital city. Plagueis sat across from Palpatine offering the young man a glass of dark wine and outlining a precise, step-by-step path to achieving absolute political power within the Republic's Senate. He offered Palpatine massive financial backing and direct access to his deep network of corporate allies in exchange for his absolute loyalty. Palpatine accepted the offer, grasping Plagueis's hand across the table. Plagueis revealed his true identity as a Dark Lord of the Sith, taking Palpatine as his apprentice and bestowing upon him the title of Darth Sidious. Plagueis and Sidious operated in complete tandem, perfectly dividing the responsibilities of the grand plan. Sidious utilized the massive financial resources of his master to secure a seat in the Galactic Senate, standing at the polished podiums and delivering passionate speeches to the gathered representatives. He shook hands with the Jedi Masters in the temple corridors, perfectly masking his dark side signature beneath a calm, completely placid physical demeanor. Meanwhile, Plagueis remained hidden inside his mountain laboratory on Sojourn, continuing his relentless biological experiments. He successfully utilized the dark side to physically heal deep, lethal wounds on his own body, repairing severed arteries and crushed bones within seconds. He pushed his research toward the ultimate goal of spontaneous physical creation, attempting to force the midi-chlorians to spontaneously generate entirely new life directly from the raw energy of the Force. The master and apprentice met in secret on the observation deck of the Sojourn facility, looking out over the dark, rain-swept forest. Plagueis handed Sidious a heavy, secure datapad detailing the final stages of the grand plan. The plan required Sidious to orchestrate a massive, galaxy-wide military conflict, a war designed entirely to physically exhaust the Jedi Order and force the Republic to willingly surrender its absolute authority. Plagueis instructed Sidious to manipulate the corporate guilds into forming a separatist military alliance, ordering the immediate mass production of heavy battle droids and heavily armed assault cruisers. Plagueis intended to remain in the shadows as the immortal puppet master, ruling the galaxy through Sidious, while he continued to perfect his absolute mastery over physical life and death. He turned his back to his apprentice, entirely unaware that his successful manipulation of biology had already made his own continued physical existence completely obsolete in the eyes of his student. Darth Sidious stood on the plush red carpeting of the Chancellor's office suite, adjusting the heavy, embroidered sleeves of his Naboo senatorial robes. He looked across the wide, polished wooden desk at the sitting Supreme Chancellor. Sidious kept his facial expression entirely neutral, resting his hands politely in his lap and softening his vocal tone to a gentle, accommodating level. He spent hours inside the Senate rotunda, physically navigating the crowded hoverpods and shaking the hands of thousands of planetary delegates. He smiled at the local governors, remembering their specific names and local planetary issues, and subtly dropping suggestions that undermined the current administration's trade policies. He returned to his private apartments in the Coruscant upper levels, shutting the heavy blast doors and discarding his colorful senatorial robes. He slipped into a coarse black robe, pulling the deep cowl down over his forehead to cast his face in absolute shadow. In this dark guise, Sidious utilized encrypted holonet frequencies to contact the leaders of the Trade Federation and the Techno Union. He projected a massive, towering holographic image of his hooded figure into their private boardrooms. He ordered the Neimoidian executives to completely surround the small agricultural planet of Naboo with heavily armed Lucra Hulk-class battleships. He mandated a total physical blockade of all incoming and outgoing supply freighters, intentionally creating an immediate humanitarian crisis designed solely to expose the physical impotence of the Republic Senate. The Trade Federation followed his exact instructions, locking their massive circular warships into a tight orbital formation and landing thousands of B-1 battle droids directly onto the grassy plains of Naboo. The droids marched through the cobbled streets of the capital city, pointing their blaster rifles at the local citizens and physically detaining the young planetary queen. The Jedi Council, sitting in the Coruscant Temple, detected the immediate disturbance in the Force. They dispatched 2 Jedi Knights, a Master and a Padawan, on a small, unarmed diplomatic cruiser to physically board the Trade Federation command ship and negotiate an immediate end to the blockade. Sidious watched the progress of the Jedi through the surveillance cameras on the Neimoidian bridge. He immediately transmitted a tight beam signal to his own apprentice, a heavily tattooed Zabrak named Darth Maul. Maul waited in the cargo hold of his stealth ship, sharpening the twin red blades of his double-bladed lightsaber. Sidious ordered Maul to travel directly to Naboo, hunt down the 2 Jedi negotiators, and execute them in plain sight. This direct, physical confrontation was specifically designed to shatter the Republic's belief that the Sith had been entirely eradicated during the Ruusan Reformation 1,000 years prior. Maul arrived on the surface of Naboo, dropping his heavy speeder bike onto the desert sands and tracking the Jedi to the massive plasma refinery complex in the capital city. He engaged the 2 Jedi Knights on a narrow catwalk, suspended over a bottomless generator shaft. The 3 combatants swung their lightsabers with incredible physical speed, their blades clashing and casting flashes of red, blue, and green light across the dark metal walls of the complex. Maul used his raw physical strength, driving the metal hilt of his weapon into the face of the Jedi Master and kicking the Padawan backward into the heavy energy gates. He drove his crimson blade straight through the chest of the Jedi Master, dropping him onto the metal grating. The young Padawan retaliated with a fierce series of aggressive, 2-handed strikes, ultimately swinging his blue lightsaber straight through Maul's torso and completely bisecting the Sith apprentice. Maul's 2 halves tumbled backward, falling directly into the deep, dark generator shaft. Back on Coruscant, the Galactic Senate reacted to the physical confirmation of the Sith's return with immediate panic. The delegates shouted over one another, demanding stronger leadership and a complete restructuring of the Republic's defensive protocols. Sidious, perfectly maintaining his guise as the humble senator from Naboo, stood in his repulsor pod and requested a direct vote of no confidence against the current chancellor. The Senate overwhelmingly approved the motion, physically removing the sitting chancellor from his podium and electing Palpatine as the new supreme executive of the Galactic Republic. He accepted the position with a bowed head and a polite smile, physically securing the absolute highest office of the Republic government, exactly according to the design of the Grand Plan. With the chancellorship secured, Sidious returned his attention to the ongoing biological experiments of his master. He traveled to Plagueis's high-rise penthouse on Coruscant late in the evening. He found his master sleeping heavily, resting after a grueling series of complex cellular manipulations. Sidious stood over the bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Plagueis's chest. He generated a massive surge of pure dark side energy, channeling the power directly into his fingertips. He unleashed a sustained barrage of blue force lightning directly into Plagueis's face and chest. The electrical current shattered the medical monitors and scorched the expensive silk bedding. Plagueis convulsed violently, entirely unable to breathe or physically defend himself against the continuous barrage. Sidious maintained the attack until the moon's body stopped moving completely. He stood over the smoking corpse, lowering his hands and observing the physical culmination of the rule of 2. He claimed absolute control over both the Republic government and the entire dark side lineage, ready to finalize the 1,000-year conflict with the creation of a massive, galaxy-spanning empire. Chancellor Palpatine stood behind the heavy durasteel podium in the center of the Senate rotunda. He picked up a metallic stylus and pressed the sharp tip into a stack of physical flimsiplast documents, officially authorizing the creation of the Grand Army of the Republic. Far across the galaxy, heavy rain lashed against the steep, slanted windows of the cloning facilities on the ocean planet of Camino. Millions of identically cloned soldiers marched in perfect synchronization across the polished white floor grates. They wore thick, white plastoid armor plates and gripped heavy black blaster rifles in their gloved hands. The soldiers boarded sleek, wedge-shaped assault cruisers, loading crates of thermal detonators and medical supplies into the cargo bays. The cruisers ignited their blue sublight engines, rising through the constant downpour and jumping into the hyperspace lanes to deploy across the galaxy. On the arid, rocky surface of Geonosis, Geonosian engineers pulled heavy iron levers and adjusted the pressure valves inside massive subterranean foundries. Sparks showered across the stone floors as automated welding arms fused durasteel chassis together. Millions of skeletal, tan-colored battle droids marched out of the manufacturing lines, immediately grasping long-barreled blaster rifles from the weapon racks. Heavy spider walkers and armored hailfire droids rolled out of the dark tunnels, crushing the dry red dirt beneath their metal treads. The Trade Federation commanders directed these mechanical armies to board spherical core ships, launching them outward to completely blockade key industrial worlds and agricultural sectors. The Jedi Knights on Coruscant stripped off their traditional, soft-woven tunics and unlaced their simple leather boots. They bolted heavy plasteel chest pieces over their ribs and strapped thick cortosis bracers to their forearms. They mirrored the exact physical appearance of the ancient Jedi Lords who had fought the Sith warlords a millennium prior. The Jedi boarded the Republic assault ships and traveled directly to the front lines. They ignited their blue and green lightsabers, stepping out of the troop transports and walking into the muddy, water-filled trenches. They swung their superheated blades through the metal torsos of the advancing battle droids, leaving the severed mechanical parts sparking in the dirt. They deflected incoming red plasma bolts, turning their wrists to send the laser fire crashing into the nearby stone ridges. The continuous combat forced the Jedi completely out of their meditation chambers and back into the harsh physical realities of war. The Jedi generals sat inside temporary canvas command tents, wiping thick layers of brown mud and gray ash from their faces. They pointed the metal hilts of their lightsabers at glowing blue holographic tactical maps, adjusting the markers of the Republic infantry columns and directing artillery strikes. They slept on rigid metal cots, listening to the constant, deafening roar of the heavy proton cannons firing in the distance. The intense physical exhaustion slowed their reflexes and battered their physical bodies. Inside his plush, crimson-carpeted office on Coruscant, Chancellor Palpatine sat behind his wide, polished wooden desk. He rested his hands on the smooth surface and utilized two separate, heavily encrypted communication terminals. He activated the first terminal, projecting his holographic image into the Jedi command tents and handing the Jedi generals the precise coordinates of the separatist weapon foundries. He immediately deactivated the first terminal, turned his chair, and pressed the transmission stud on the second device. He projected a hooded, shadowy figure into the boardrooms of the separatist commanders, directly providing them with the exact defensive layouts and weak points of the approaching Republic fleets. He manually directed the physical movements of both massive armies, pushing them into brutal, high-casualty engagements in the mud and the snow. Palpatine utilized these endless battles to physically pull the Jedi Knights far away from the core worlds. He assigned the most powerful and experienced Jedi Masters to the most remote, volatile battlefronts in the Outer Rim. The Jedi generals marched their clone battalions through the humid, fungal swamps of Felucia and across the freezing, snow-covered bridges of Mygeeto. They fought back-to-back with the clone troopers, entirely dependent on the physical protection of the soldiers standing beside them. The clone troopers gripped their blaster rifles, stepping over the destroyed chassis of the battle droids and waiting closely for the specific, pre-programmed verbal command from the Supreme Chancellor to turn their weapons entirely upon their Jedi commanders. The Clone Wars ripped through the physical infrastructure of the Galactic Republic, transforming the entire galaxy into an active battleground. Republic Venator-class Star Destroyers engaged separatist Lucrehulk battleships in the skies above Coruscant, sending flaming debris crashing through the dense city traffic and smashing into the lower durasteel levels. Clone troopers fired heavy rotary cannons in the deep, waterlogged trenches of mud-soaked Outer Rim planets. General Grievous marched his massive droid armies across the rocky surface of Utapau, utilizing the harsh terrain to funnel the Republic forces into lethal kill zones. The sheer physical toll of the continuous conflict entirely exhausted the Republic's supply lines, leaving the Senate directly reliant on the Supreme Chancellor to quickly authorize emergency funding and immediate military deployments. Palpatine sat behind his heavy desk, physically signing the Emergency Powers Acts with sharp strokes of his metal stylus. He looked down at the physical reports of Jedi casualties, noting the names of the fallen masters and the specific planetary systems where they died. He directed his clone commanders to constantly accompany the Jedi generals, recording their tactical decisions and closely analyzing their combat forms. Palpatine intentionally isolated the strongest Jedi from one another, sending them on prolonged, grueling campaigns that required them to expend massive amounts of physical energy simply to survive the continuous droid assaults. He ensured that the Jedi Temple remained constantly depleted of its most capable defenders, leaving the younger Padawans and the elderly masters to manage the daily operations of the Grand Archives. Inside the Senate Rotunda, Palpatine maintained absolute physical control over the legislative process. He stood at his podium, his voice amplified by the massive sound system, and firmly requested the immediate creation of local planetary security forces independent of Jedi oversight. He dispatched heavy crates of credits and raw coaxium to the specific senators who supported his motions, physically cementing their loyalty through direct financial incentive. He systematically replaced the independent military commanders with his own fiercely loyal officers, positioning them precisely at the head of the largest clone battalions. The Jedi Council watched the rapid restructuring of the Republic command chain, their faces tight with concern as they reviewed the new deployment rosters on their glowing blue datapads. Palpatine invited a young, physically gifted Jedi Knight named Anakin Skywalker into his private office. Palpatine poured thick, dark wine into 2 crystal goblets and pushed one across the polished desk. He spoke softly, praising Skywalker's physical combat skills and his aggressive, unyielding approach to the Clone Wars. He pointed to the thick files detailing the rigid rules and the strict, inflexible dogma of the Jedi Council. Palpatine leaned across the desk, looking directly into Skywalker's eyes, and explicitly detailed a physical path to achieving absolute power outside the constraints of the Jedi Order. He spoke of ancient, forbidden techniques capable of physically manipulating life and entirely preventing the biological reality of death. Skywalker gripped the crystal goblet tightly, his knuckles turning white as he listened to the precise, calculated promises of the Supreme Chancellor. The physical exhaustion of the war finally reached a critical breaking point on the battlefields. The Jedi generals pushed their clone battalions forward in a massive, final push to capture the key separatist leaders. Master Mace Windu and a small strike team of heavily armed Jedi Knights marched up the stone steps of the Chancellor's office. They ignited their lightsabers, casting bright purple, blue, and green light across the plush red carpeting. They pointed their weapons directly at Palpatine, physically demanding his immediate arrest and the absolute surrender of his emergency powers. Palpatine stood up from his heavy wooden desk, letting his senatorial robes drop to the floor. He ignited a short, cylindrical red lightsaber, the crimson blade snapping into existence with a sharp hiss. He lunged across the room with incredible physical speed, driving his red blade directly through the chests of the Jedi Knights before they could even raise their weapons to block the strike. The physical clash between Palpatine and Windu shattered the heavy transparisteel windows of the office, sending jagged shards of glass falling down into the crowded city streets below. Windu swung his purple blade in heavy, aggressive arcs, forcing Palpatine backward toward the open window. Windu physically overpowered the Sith Lord, kicking the red lightsaber out of Palpatine's hand and pointing his own weapon directly at the Chancellor's throat. Skywalker rushed into the office, his boots crunching on the broken glass. He looked at the defeated Chancellor and the raised blade of the Jedi Master. Palpatine raised his hands, unleashing a sustained barrage of pure blue Force lightning directly at Windu. The physical impact of the energy pushed Windu backward, completely overwhelming his defensive posture. Skywalker ignited his own blue lightsaber, stepped forward, and swiftly severed Windu's weapon arm at the wrist. The Jedi Master fell out of the shattered window, his body disappearing into the deep, dark traffic lanes of Coruscant. Palpatine lowered his hands, looked at the young knight standing over the scorch marks on the carpet, and formally bestowed upon him the title of Darth Vader. Darth Vader marched up the sweeping marble steps of the Jedi Temple, his heavy black boots striking the polished stone in perfect unison with the 501st Legion. Hundreds of clone troopers followed directly behind him, their white plastoid armor contrasting sharply against the dimly lit Coruscant evening. They gripped their heavy DC-15A blaster rifles, keeping the barrels completely leveled and their fingers tight against the triggers. Vader unclipped the cylindrical metal hilt from his belt and ignited his blue lightsaber, casting a bright, humming light across the massive Durasteel doors. The clone troopers fanned out across the grand courtyards, physically cutting off all exits and securing the primary landing pads. Vader pushed the heavy temple doors open, stepping into the massive central nave and raising his blade toward the remaining Jedi defenders. The temple guards ignited their double-bladed yellow lightsabers, stepping forward to block the main corridors. The clone troopers opened fire, pouring concentrated volleys of blue plasma directly into the Jedi ranks. The laser blasts scorched the ancient stone pillars and shattered the glass mosaic windows, sending heavy shards falling onto the floor grates. Vader swung his blue blade with brutal, aggressive force, cutting through the cortosis armor of the guards and driving his boots into their chests. He walked through the grand archives, watching the clone troopers fire heavy incendiary charges into the rows of physical data tapes and ancient holocrons. Thick black smoke filled the reading rooms as thousands of years of recorded Jedi history burned into ash. Vader struck down the elderly masters and the young Padawans alike, leaving their scorch-marked bodies scattered across the woven meditation mats. Across the galaxy, the exact same physical purge occurred on a massive scale. Republic clone commanders received the encrypted transmission, designated Order 66, directly from the Supreme Chancellor. The troopers immediately lowered their blaster rifles, pivoting away from the separatist droid armies and aiming their weapons directly at the backs of their Jedi generals. On the humid, fungal world of Felucia, the clones fired a concentrated volley of heavy plasma bolts into the chest of Ayla Secura, dropping her lifeless body onto the vibrant blue moss. On the bridge of a Republic cruiser above Cato Neimoidia, clone pilots opened fire on Plo Koon's interceptor, blasting the starfighter's twin ion engines and sending the ship crashing violently into the planetary cities below. The physical bonds forged between the Jedi and their clone troopers completely dissolved in an instant, replaced by rigid programming and absolute military execution. Darth Sidious stood before the emergency session of the Galactic Senate, wearing a thick, dark crimson robe that completely covered his scarred and heavily blistered face. He grasped the edges of his heavy wooden podium, his voice echoing loudly through the massive sound system. He detailed the physical rebellion of the Jedi Order, pointing to the scorched carpet and shattered windows of his private office as direct physical evidence of their treason. He announced the complete reorganization of the Galactic Republic into the First Galactic Empire, guaranteeing a new era of absolute security and strictly enforced order. The thousands of planetary delegates stood in their repulsor pods and clapped their hands, their applause filling the massive rotunda. Sidious looked out over the cheering senators, his yellow eyes visible beneath the deep cowl of his robe, completely satisfied that the Republic had willfully surrendered its own physical freedom. Vader traveled to the volcanic planet of Mustafar, landing his sleek silver interceptor on a small Durasteel platform surrounded by rivers of molten rock. He walked into the Separatist command center, his boots leaving dark tracks on the metal floor. The Trade Federation leaders and corporate executives looked up from their tactical maps, raising their hands in confusion. Vader ignited his blue lightsaber and physically locked the heavy blast doors behind him. He moved through the room with swift, mechanical precision, severing the limbs of the Separatist commanders and driving his blade directly through their chests. He completely eradicated the leadership of the Separatist movement, permanently shutting down the massive subterranean droid foundries on Geonosis, and physically ending the Clone Wars with a single, brutal massacre. Sidious sat on a newly constructed, elevated throne in the center of the Coruscant Imperial Palace. He watched the physical transformation of his new empire through the heavy transparasteel viewports. The white armor of the clone troopers slowly transitioned into the stark, uniform plating of the Imperial stormtroopers. The Republic assault cruisers received thick coats of gray paint, their hulls physically expanding into the massive, wedge-shaped profiles of Imperial star destroyers. Sidious pressed his hands against the armrests of his throne, observing the complete physical subjugation of the galaxy. The thousand-year grand plan culminated entirely in this moment. The hidden lineage of Darth Bane finally broke the physical limitations of the shadows, placing the absolute power of the dark side directly at the undisputed center of the known galaxy. The Imperial star destroyers hung perfectly motionless above the core worlds, their massive Durasteel hulls blocking the sunlight and casting sharp, triangular shadows across the cityscapes. The Imperial Navy physically dismantled the old Republic shipping lanes, establishing heavily fortified checkpoints and scanning every freighter that passed through the hyperlanes. Stormtroopers in stark white plastoid armor patrolled the streets of Coruscant, carrying E-11 blaster rifles and demanding physical identification cylinders from the civilian populations. They set up heavy barricades around the former Jedi temple, bolting thick durasteel plates over the massive front doors and stringing razor wire across the stone steps. The Imperial engineers repurposed the ancient structure into the Imperial Palace, stripping the woven meditation mats from the floors and hanging massive red and black banners bearing the Imperial crest from the high vaulted ceilings. Darth Vader utilized the newly constructed Imperial fleet to completely eradicate the remaining pockets of Separatist resistance and Jedi survivors. He stood on the command bridge of his personal Star Destroyer, his heavy black cape resting over his dark cybernetic armor. He listened to the rhythmic, mechanical rasp of his own respirator, watching the blue holographic tactical displays pinpoint the hidden bases of the surviving Jedi Knights. He deployed directly to these locations, stepping out of his shuttle and igniting his red lightsaber. He engaged the Jedi in brutal physical combat, relying on the immense kinetic power of his cybernetic limbs to shatter their defenses. He drove his heavy boots into their chests and swung his blade with relentless, heavy strikes, leaving their scorched bodies on the dirt. He returned to his flagship, securely locking the captured lightsabers into the metal storage containers inside his private meditation chamber. Emperor Palpatine sat on his elevated throne, continuously expanding his absolute physical control over the galaxy. He directed the Imperial mining guilds to entirely strip the resources of the Outer Rim planets. Massive crawler vehicles tore through the bedrock of Lothal and Kashyyyk, extracting raw duunium and heavy metals. The Imperial labor camps processed these materials, feeding the continuous construction of new Star Destroyers and heavy Walker variants. Palpatine utilized these massive military assets to crush local rebellions, ordering his fleet commanders to completely bombard any city that refused to physically submit to Imperial law. He entirely bypassed the political bureaucracy of the old Senate, directly appointing regional Moffs to govern the specific planetary sectors and enforcing his will through the immediate application of overwhelming military force. The Inquisitorius, a specialized order of dark side operatives, assisted Vader in the physical extermination of the Jedi Order. These former Jedi Knights, broken and physically tortured into absolute submission, wore dark gray armor and carried specialized, double-bladed spinning lightsabers. They hunted down the young Padawans and the hiding masters, tracking their physical movements across the galaxy. They utilized brutal interrogation techniques, strapping their captives to metal examination tables and injecting chemical truth serums directly into their bloodstreams. They extracted the specific coordinates of hidden Jedi enclaves, launching targeted strikes and burning the safe houses to the ground. The Inquisitors physically delivered the captured Jedi to Vader, standing aside as the Dark Lord executed the survivors and added their lightsabers to his growing collection. The remaining Jedi Masters completely abandoned their traditional robes and metal lightsaber hilts. They traveled to the most remote, inhospitable environments in the galaxy, intentionally isolating themselves from the heavily patrolled hyperlanes. Obi-Wan Kenobi lived in a small, domed mud brick hut on the searing desert world of Tatooine, wrapping his face in heavy linen bandages to protect his skin from the blowing sand. Yoda retreated to the humid, dense swamps of Dagobah, constructing a small wooden hovel from the twisted roots of the massive gnarl trees. They completely suppressed their physical connection to the Force, intentionally lowering their energy signatures to evade the Imperial scanners. They accepted the physical reality of their defeat, entirely shifting their focus away from active combat and preparing to silently train the next generation of Jedi in absolute secrecy. The physical construction of the Death Star dominated the Imperial military budget. Millions of labor droids and conscripted workers assembled the massive, moon-sized battle station in the deep orbit of Geonosis. They locked the heavy durasteel outer panels into place and wired the massive kyber crystal arrays directly into the central superlaser firing tube. Palpatine planned to utilize this ultimate physical weapon to permanently cement his absolute rule, intending to completely vaporize any planet that dared to resist his authority. The physical manifestation of his power hung directly over the galaxy, a massive sphere of gray metal designed specifically to enforce the exact same principles of absolute physical dominance established by Darth Ruin 1,000 years earlier. Rebel starfighter squadrons launched from hidden jungle bases, propelling their X-wings and Y-wings into the deep space. They flew their ships around the standard Imperial blockades and traveled directly toward the gray, spherical hull of the Death Star. The Rebel pilots pulled their flight yokes, navigating through the narrow equatorial trench of the battle station. Green turbo laser fire erupted from the metal walls, striking the deflector shields of the advancing fighters and sending spinning debris crashing against the durasteel plating. Darth Vader boarded his custom TIE Advanced Interceptor, flying out of the main hangar bay and firing heavy laser cannons into the engines of the Rebel ships. A targeted proton torpedo dropped straight down the thermal exhaust port, traveling the entire length of the shaft to strike the central hypermatter core. The resulting chain reaction tore the massive space station apart, scattering millions of tons of superheated metal across the nearby star system. Emperor Palpatine viewed the physical destruction of his prime weapon through a secure holographic transmission on Coruscant. He sent thousands of probe droids across the outer rim, searching the desolate ice plains and mud swamps for the hidden Rebel command centers. A probe droid transmitted a heavily encrypted signal from the frozen surface of Hoth, showing the specific coordinates of the Rebel power generators. Vader mobilized Death Squadron, sending massive AT-AT walkers down through the freezing atmosphere. The four-legged machines lumbered across the glaciers, crushing the ice beneath their heavy mechanical feet. They fired continuous streams of red plasma into the snowbanks, melting the frozen water and exposing the entrenched Rebel infantry. Snowtroopers deployed from the heavy transports, marching over the blasted ice and shooting their E-11 blasters into the retreating Rebel soldiers. The Rebels rushed into their cargo haulers, ignited the thrusters, and launched into the dark asteroid fields surrounding the planet. The Imperial Navy immediately began the construction of a second Death Star, stationing the partially built sphere above the forest moon of Endor. Palpatine traveled directly to this new command center, walking up the metal ramp of his shuttle and taking his seat in the high tower. He lured the entire Rebel fleet into a direct, physical confrontation, ordering his Star Destroyers to completely encircle the opposing cruisers. Outside the transparasteel window, the Rebel fleet engaged the Imperial Star Destroyers in a massive, chaotic dogfight. X-wings and TIE fighters spun around the heavy frigates, firing concentrated laser blasts into the command bridges and engine blocks. Explosions bloomed in the dark space, illuminating the floating debris fields with bright yellow and orange light. A Rebel star cruiser rammed its hull directly into the side of an Imperial dreadnought, tearing the metal plating apart and sending both massive ships drifting out of the combat zone. Luke Skywalker handed his weapons to the Imperial stormtroopers and walked into the Emperor's throne room, wearing a plain black tunic. He reached his hand out, using the Force to pull his lightsaber from Palpatine's armrest, and ignited the green blade. Vader ignited his own red weapon, stepping in front of his master and blocking the heavy overhead strike. The two warriors swung their blades with immense kinetic force, parrying strikes and driving their heavy boots against the metal grating. The combatants pushed each other into the dimly lit areas beneath the main viewing platform. Luke swung his weapon in a wide arc, slicing completely through Vader's cybernetic right wrist. Sparks showered from the severed wires as the red lightsaber tumbled into the deep shadows below the stairs. Luke powered down his green blade, tossing the heavy metal hilt onto the floor and walking away from the wounded cyborg. Palpatine rose from his black swivel chair, raising his wrinkled hands and firing concentrated bolts of blue force lightning into Luke's body. The electrical arcs burned through the fabric of his tunic and sent him collapsing onto the metal deck. Vader stood up, walked behind Palpatine, and lifted the Emperor entirely off the floor. Vader carried the struggling Sith Lord to the edge of the reactor shaft and threw him into the abyss. The falling body impacted the hypermatter core, generating a massive upward surge of blue energy that washed over Vader's dark armor. The electrical shock destroyed the internal circuitry of his life support respirator. Luke dragged Vader's heavy body away from the reactor shaft, pulling him toward the open loading ramp of an Imperial shuttle. Vader collapsed onto the metal floor plates, requesting the immediate removal of his dark helmet. Luke reached down, opening the pressurized seals locking the collar in place, and lifted the heavy black dome from Vader's head. The pale, scarred face of Anakin Skywalker met the harsh lighting of the hangar bay. Skywalker closed his eyes and released his final breath, leaving his physical body completely still on the metal ramp. The absolute physical collapse of the Sith Lords shattered the foundation of the Galactic Empire, setting the stage for the final restoration of the Republic. The Rebel Alliance rapidly established a completely new central command structure on the heavily forested planet of Chandrila. Mon Mothma stood at the head of the long, polished wooden table, smoothing the heavy white fabric of her senatorial robes. She addressed the assembled military generals and sector delegates, striking her metal datapad against the table to call the room to order. She physically outlined the massive logistical undertaking required to convert their ragged rebel fleet into the official defensive force of the new republic. She signed the heavy, flimsy-plast documents, formally declaring the new republic a legitimate galactic government, placing her signature directly beside the physical seals of over 100 allied planetary systems. She ordered the immediate redeployment of the surviving X-Wing squadrons, directing them to physically hunt down and capture the retreating Imperial Star Destroyers scattering across the mid-rim. The remaining Imperial warlords retreated to the Outer Rim territories, physically locking down their regional command centers and refusing to acknowledge the fall of Coruscant. Grand Admiral Ray Sloane stood on the bridge of her heavily damaged Star Destroyer, watching the blue sparks jump from the cracked primary control consoles. She issued direct, physical commands to her stormtrooper battalions, ordering them to strip the raw coaxium from the local planetary reserves and load the fuel onto the surviving transport ships. She tightened her grip on the metal railing, refusing to surrender her physical control over the local sector. She directed her navigation officers to plot a highly complex, heavily encrypted jump into the unknown regions, physically removing her fleet from the standard galactic maps and establishing a completely hidden staging ground to eventually rebuild the Imperial war machine. Luke Skywalker returned to the ancient, moss-covered stone steps of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. He walked past the massive, scorched durasteel barricades left behind by the Imperial garrison. He pushed the heavy doors open, stepping onto the cracked marble floor of the central nave. He picked up the burned and shattered remnants of the physical holocrons, turning the blackened crystal shards over in his calloused hands. He ignited his green lightsaber, utilizing the bright plasma blade to cut away the heavy iron chains wrapping the entrance to the Grand Archives. He gathered the few surviving data tapes and physical texts, packing the material into heavy canvas satchels. He refused to permanently occupy the Coruscant Temple, physically carrying the collected knowledge back to his X-Wing. He intended to establish a completely new training academy on a remote, deeply forested world, far from the central political bureaucracy of the New Republic. The physical cleanup of the galactic battlefields took decades. Heavy salvage ships dragged massive magnetic nets across the orbital lanes of Endor and Hoth, pulling millions of tons of twisted durasteel and shattered solar panels into their cargo holds. Scrappers landed their small freighters on the muddy surface of Mimban, cutting the thick metal legs off the rusted AT-AT walkers with heavy plasma torches. They sold the raw scrap metal in the bustling, neon-lit market districts of the core worlds. The New Republic engineers poured fresh duracrete over the massive craters left by the Imperial orbital bombardments, physically rebuilding the ruined agricultural centers and industrial factories. The physical remnants of the Galactic Empire slowly vanished from the daily sightlines of the Republic citizens. Deep within the unknown regions, the surviving Imperial forces physically constructed the foundation of the First Order. They landed their dreadnoughts on the frozen, icy surface of Starkiller Base, utilizing heavy mining lasers to bore deep into the planetary crust. They laid thousands of miles of thick fiber-optic cables and heavy power conduits, physically connecting the massive thermal oscillators to the planetary core. Stormtroopers wearing stark white, completely redesigned armor marched in perfect synchronization across the polished metal parade grounds. They raised their heavy blaster rifles in absolute unison, pointing the barrels toward the sky. General Hux stood on the high metal balcony, wearing a crisp, perfectly tailored black uniform. He shouted his commands across the frozen canyon, physically demanding absolute loyalty and preparing to launch a massive, entirely unexpected military strike directly against the heart of the New Republic. The physical cycle of conflict between the light and the dark side reset itself once again. The massive, galaxy-spanning wars continually reshaped the physical topography of the planets and the structural composition of the governments. From the initial spark of Darth Ruin's absolute pride, through the long, muddy trenches of the new Sith Wars, and up to the precise, mechanized destruction of the Death Stars, the opposing forces completely exhausted their physical resources in pursuit of total dominance. The individuals died, their physical bodies collapsing onto the metal grates and turning to ash in the blast zones. But the heavy weapons and the deeply ingrained philosophies survived. The next generation picked up the discarded lightsabers, bolted the heavy armor plates over their chests, and marched their legions straight back onto the battlefield. And so the long war continues, endlessly echoing through the stars. The battles fade into history, and the history fades into myth, but the clash of the light and the dark never truly rests. The fire burns low now, and the shadows in this refuge are growing long. The stories of empires and broken knights have run their course for this evening. Rest your head, traveler. Let the silence of the void settle over you, and let the heavy burdens of the galaxy drift away. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and find your peace in the quiet dark.